Welcome, everyone, this is your friend, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of, what if Loki time traveled to kill Thanos? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic, the 17th of September 2020. New York City, USA. The plan failed. Nebula's dead, Thor captured. Loki's stomach twisted with nausea as he stared at Stark's message. Thanos hadn't remained idle for long. He realized soon enough that his snap had sparked as many conflicts as it had finished. Now his fleets were tearing through one planet after another, trying to pacify what was left of the universe. And for 2 years, Thor and his motley crew of companions had shadowed Thanos in hope of finding a way to overcome him. Loki hadn't seen his brother since that fateful day when Thanos had found their ship and decided to bring balance to what few Asgardians had survived Ragnarok. By the time Loki managed to find his way to Midgard, Thor had already left in pursuit of vengeance. Communication was difficult. The distances were vast and secrecy paramount. So Loki had to content himself with mere snippets about Thor's locations and plans. The last he had heard, things were looking up. They thought they found a way to Thanos. Loki had even dared to hope that Stark would finally come through. Evidently, he hadn't. "Loki?" Wong asked in a hesitant tone. "My brother is captured," Loki replied and thrust out Stark's curt missive for Wong to see. "No, he's dead." Thor already survived not one, but 2 encounters with Thanos. There wouldn't be a third, Thanos wouldn't permit that. Wong crossed his arms and sighed. "Your brother is resourceful. He nearly killed Thanos once, don't forget that." "I'm sure Thanos hasn't forgotten." Loki examined the message again. No date. How long ago had Stark sent this? Thor had probably been dead for weeks. At that thought, another wave of nausea assailed him. Loki wrapped his arms around himself and clenched his eyes in an effort to prevent himself from dissolving into a blubbering mess in front of Wong. But it made little difference, he could feel his self-control slipping. "No, this won't do." Loki gritted his teeth and forced himself to straighten his body. "Hey, are you? I can't sit around here weeping and moping like a useless invalid," Loki said. "I've given them the chance to do it their way. They failed, there's no alternative left." "No way." Wong shoved himself between Loki and the passageway to the Sanctum Library. "Stand aside, I'm only doing what I should have done the day I found that notebook." "Look, you're upset. This isn't the time to be making any decisions, let alone to be trying this. What's the chance the spell will work? Most likely you'll blow yourself to pieces and take half of New York with you." Loki tilted his head wearily. Half of New York is already gone." Before Wong could reply, Loki flicked his hand and sent Wong flying towards the windows at the far end of the room. Loki muttered an apology under his breath. After the care Wong had taken with Loki after he found Loki on the Sanctum's doorstep, the man deserved better from him. But in the end, it was simple. Loki's mind was made up and Wong had stood in his way. Loki knew he would need every spark of magic contained within him, so as he walked, he dropped the cloaking spells wrapped around him. His smooth stride acquired a haltering limp and he felt his prosthetic rubbing painfully against the scarred stump of his right leg. Loki had never thought his trick with the knife had much chance of success against Thanos and had planned accordingly. But he hadn't anticipated the fire. Setting down Stark's note on the mahogany desk in the center of the Sanctum Library, Loki pulled out the right notebook out of the stacks scattered around the room. He didn't need much time to prepare. He had studied the spell day in and day out for months after he had stumbled across it in the jumbled theoretical posturings one of Strange's predecessors had left behind. Nevertheless, his fingers trembled. That is, more than they usually did nowadays, as he flicked to the right page and began the spell work. The movements came swiftly and the words that he had recited in his mind 1,000 times flowed, one line melting into the next. But at the very last line, his breath hitched. In truth, the spell was anathema to him. Loki had learned long ago that a hedged bet was the only sure way in life, but the spell didn't permit such indulgence. This was a one-way route. Loki took a deep breath and glanced over to Tony's message, rereading the few words it contained one more time. If this was the world you were escaping, a one-way route wasn't so bad, was it? All it took was 4 last words of the incantation and a flick of Loki's wrist. A toneless howl assaulted his ears. Up, down, future, past. All melted away. He tumbled wildly, unable to make sense of the bright lights flashing past him. Loki. The howling had ceased. As someone placed their hands on his shoulder and gently rolled him onto his back, the flashes gave way to a single blinding light suspended high above him. Was this it? Or was this only some temporary reprieve? He didn't recount falling or landing, yet his back was now pressed against something smooth and solid. Groaning, Loki pushed himself off the ground and propped himself up on his elbows. Frigga knelt beside him, sunlight turning her hair golden and catching her eyes just at the right angle to make them shine. What little compose Loki still possessed fled him. He scrambled away from her and backed into the balcony railing. "What's happened?" Frigga said. "Loki." Her voice was as soft and kind as he remembered it. Her face, presently dark with worry, was also a perfect reconstruction of his memory. After she had died, he had spent hours upon hours lost in the old memories. Then Frigga moved a step towards him and Loki realized he wasn't exactly right. She looked younger than she had been in her last days. His mother didn't yet possess the lines his madness would etch upon her face. Is this a trick? Or did I really come back years too far? Loki climbed to his feet and leant against the railing as he palpated his right shoulder. It ached. He must have pulled something when he had landed, but it didn't feel like a serious injury. "I'm fine, Mother. I was experimenting with a new spell last night and it didn't go as planned. An unfortunate after effect, nothing more." "Really? You fainted and slid out of your seat halfway through breakfast. Besides, you were with us at the feast last night." Loki glanced to the large oval table that stood in the middle of the balcony. It was laden with food, breads, jams, cold meats, fresh fruit and a variety of cheeses. All barely touched. One of the chairs had been flipped over. It was the one Loki usually occupied when he shared breakfast with his mother out on the balcony of her quarters. Loki glanced back over the balcony railing and felt a lump solidify in his throat. His mother's garden was in full bloom. This was too much. It had been a bitter journey, but in the end he had reconciled with her death and with the knowledge that all vestiges of her life, save Loki himself, had perished either in Ragnarok or by Thanos' hand. Yet here she is. Seeing that no response was forthcoming from Loki, Frigga tried again. "You truly do look unwell. Don't tell me you were awake all night with your books, and before a day like today." Of all the things he had missed about Asgard, being chided as if he were a child again had not been one of them. Loki had a number of snide comments at the ready, but as he peered at his mother's concerned expression, he couldn't bring himself to utter any of them. "You're right," he said. "It was ill-advised. I was tired, likely that was why I erred with the spell. Do you want to go over it together? Perhaps tomorrow or the day after?" Loki smiled. He and his mother had spent so many days in the privy of her personal library, working through arcane texts or experimenting with magic of their own making. Although he usually despised to see his errors exposed, he had never minded sharing his troubles with his mother. Had there actually been a spell that was proving troublesome, he would have told Frigga about it there and then. "I think I know where I went wrong," he said instead. "Still, I would rather you weren't alone if you attempt the spell again. If these are the side effects, you're playing with something dangerous. If you knew exactly what, Mother, you'd be aghast. There was nothing dangerous about it until I skipped 2 steps in the instructions." Frigga shook her head, the familiar gesture that over the years had come to embody Frigga's repeated admonitions that he needed to be careful when it came to magic. "Let us finish breakfast then," she said, resting her hand on Loki's shoulder. He flinched. She hadn't touched him since Odin had thrown him in a cell for his attempted invasion of Midgard. That had been the telltale sign to her projections. She had always been quick to draw him into her arms, to smooth his hair or to brush away a stray speck of dust on his jacket. But not after Loki had disgraced himself. "I can't. This is too much. I've had as much food as I can stomach right now." He tried to still the quiver in his voice. "Forgive me. I will see you later, Mother." Not waiting for Frigga's response, he fled. Loki all but ran down the short corridor from his mother's quarters to the wing he shared with Thor. Paying little attention to what was around him, he nearly knocked over a pair of maids. Loki threw out a hurried apology to the 2 women and flung open the door to his own quarters. Suddenly, the manic energy that had propelled him away from his mother dissipated. He slid the door shut and leant against it. It was all as he remembered it. The oak wood furnishings, the slightly faded tapestries, the burn mark in the rug by the door. Even the smell, a peculiar mix of leather from the sparring clothes he always neglected to put away, the herbs kept in his workroom and the scent of jasmine drifting through the open windows, was unmistakably familiar. Yet Loki crept through his rooms as if he were an interloper, or rather, he supposed he was. This space belonged to his younger self. He doesn't exist anymore. The spell annihilated his mind and I stole his body. Loki had changed little about the rooms in decades, so there was nothing that could give him a clue as to the date the spell had brought him to until he entered the bedroom. The servants, knowing that he preferred to dress himself, had set out his clothes for him. The inner garments were carefully laid out on the bed, while the outer layer of armor and the accompanying cape had been placed onto a specially constructed valet stand in the corner of the room. Even in this disassembled state, he recognized the clothing immediately. Loki seized the undershirt and studied the cuffs. He had accidentally dripped a corrosive potion across a sleeve the second time he had worn it, burning several small holes through the fabric. But the cuffs on this undershirt carried no damage. Loki strode over to the armor. He searched the surface for scratches and examined the leather straps for any marks of wear. None. This entire outfit was brand new. Frigga had implied there was something out of the ordinary occurring today. Now he knew, Thor's coronation. His suspicions confirmed, Loki swore. He had set out to kill Thanos, but here he was a decade into the past and half a universe away from where he wanted to be. In fact, Loki wasn't even sure where Thanos had been this early on. What was Loki supposed to do now? Play along like a puppet, retreading the same old paths until he could get to Thanos? Living through all of that had been bad enough once. He had absolutely no desire to repeat the experience. Except, he didn't have to follow along. If he planned to change the future later on and prevent the snap, why not go back further? Here his mother still lived, so did his father and brother. Asgard too stood in its full summer glory. Why should he stand back when this was the chance to prevent all the death and destruction the next decade would bring? This time everyone gets to live, Loki muttered. A giddiness he hadn't felt since he was a child overtook him as he imagined a future where Ragnarok was only a bad dream and the works of the Infinity Gauntlet only a figment of a morbid imagination. Magic was a fickle mistress, but sometimes the gifts it offered were unparalleled. A wide grin on his face, Loki drummed his fingers against his thigh. What now? He had to begin somewhere after all, and since the spell had brought him to this particular morning, there had to have been a reason for it. Loki pursed his lips as realization hit him, his ploy to Dion. The moment Loki took his place on the stairs that led up to the throne, Frigga rested her hand on his forearm and softly said something to him. Loki couldn't parse out a single word. He supposed she was trying to be discreet, but there was no need for that. The crowd assembled in the hall was restless and all their excited chattering blended together into a discordant din. Still, her expression told him enough. He leaned towards her until his lips were half an inch from her ear. I'm fine, truly. Do forgive me for earlier, I was not myself. She smiled indulgently and Loki was certain she didn't believe him. To his relief, however, his mother didn't press the matter. She adjusted a fold in his cape, then drew back. Loki heard the roaring long before he saw Thor. Cheering from the tens of thousands assembled in Asgard's great hall sent the walls and pillars vibrating. And Thor wasn't shy about lingering to entertain the crowd. Several minutes passed until the raucous cheers spread to the front half of the hall and the crowd finally parted, revealing Thor strutting out with his hammer aloft. As Thor continued his unhurried progress to the dais where the throne of Asgard awaited him, Loki felt like his vision had split in two. He saw Thor decked out in the best armor in the 9 realms, flipping Mjolnir about as if it were a toy to the delights of the assembled thousands, all in their best silks and satins. He saw too a Thor bereft of his hammer, his cloak, his helmet, even his eye. This Thor too moved slowly through the crowd, but it was a wariness, not a desire to show off, that set his pace. And around him, the much smaller crowd, barely a smile to be found between them, stood quietly in what clothes they had left. We live so long. How can so much change in only a few years? At last Thor came to the foot of the dais. He sank to one knee and slipped off his helmet. Loki chuckled. His brother's hair hung at that awkward length about an inch below his ears. What had he been thinking? Of course, the same question could have been asked about the wink he sent their mother and the conspiratorial grin he offered his friends, who stood in a line on the opposite side of the dais to Loki and Frigga. If they seemed amused by Thor's behavior, Odin clearly wasn't. Nevertheless, he rose from his seat and brought down his spear. The assembled throng fell silent. "Thor Odinson," he said, "my kin, my firstborn son, so long entrusted with the mighty hammer Mjolnir, forged in the heart of a dying star. Its power has no equal as a weapon to destroy or as a tool to build. It is a fitting weapon for a king." Loki swallowed the solidifying lump in his throat. This was the moment it had all begun. Certainly, he had discovered a way to pass unseen between Asgard and Jotunheim months before. The agreement with the frost giants to have them come and disrupt the coronation had been in the works for weeks. But this was the moment he had actually opened the portal to let them through. This time around his task was simple, he needed only to do nothing. Yet he still found himself tuning out his father's words and focusing only on Odin's face, lest it reveal some hint that he detected an intrusion. But there was nothing, not even once Odin finished his preamble and began the ceremonial oaths themselves. "Do you swear to guard the 9 realms?" he asked. "I swear," Thor responded without hesitation. "Do you swear to preserve the peace?" "I swear." "Do you swear to cast aside all selfish ambition and to pledge yourself only to the good of the realm?" Odin's voice had risen at this last question and Thor's reply was similarly emphatic. Grinning, he raised up Mjolnir as if saluting a hard-won victory. Odin, on the other hand, seemed to grow more somber. "Then on this day," he said after a deep breath, "I, Odin Borson, proclaim you king of Asgard." The roar from the crowd was quite unlike anything Loki had heard in his life, but to his disbelief, the sound swelled further when Thor rose to his feet and turned to face the gathered Asgardians. Loki too couldn't contain a cheer, although his cause for jubilation differed to the rest of the witnesses to the coronation. The first time around Odin hadn't been able to finish his speech. Thor's ascension to king today was proof Loki could change history. After a minute or two, Thor brought Mjolnir down to hang at his side and turned to face his father once more. Odin beckoned him up. And slowly, the silly grin on his face vanishing without a trace, Thor moved up the stairs past all his friends, past Loki, past their mother and to the top of the dais where Odin alone stood. Lord Agnar, who had once offered Gungnir to Loki, had sunk to his knees as he did so. But not Odin. Once Thor was right before his father, Odin remained upright and merely extended his hands, Gungnir resting in his upturned palms. From where he stood, Loki could see their mouths moving, but they spoke too quietly for their voices to carry. Whatever was said, Thor concluded the conversation with a fervent shake of his head and took Gungnir into his left hand. The entire scene was surreal. As Odin drew back to allow Thor to climb the few remaining steps up to the throne, Loki half wondered if he were simply dreaming this. But Thor took his seat in the Allfather's throne and set down Mjolnir by his feet, while still clenching Gungnir's gilded shaft, and there was no sign of Loki waking. "This is your doing, don't pretend otherwise. And now you have your own part to play in this pageantry." Loki sucked in a breath. As brother to the new king, it was his duty to acknowledge Thor's new position. The stairs made positioning rather awkward, but he managed to make his bow look graceful nevertheless. Beside him, his mother sank into a curtsy and there was a deafening rustle of clothing and scraping of boots as the rest of Asgard bowed to their new king. When Loki straightened back up, the sense that he had abandoned reality only intensified. Thor sat rigid on the throne, his back not quite touching the backrest. Hugin had perched himself on the very top of the throne, while Munin had taken the right armrest and let out a loud caw. Odin himself took up a place beside the throne, a reflection of his new role as Thor's guide and chief advisor. Loki wasn't sure if Odin had made some cue or if Thor himself decided it was time for him to speak, but he nudged Munin off the armrest, then turned his attention back to his audience. "Father," he said, "Mother, people of Asgard, ambassadors from realms near and far, I thank you for the warm manner with which I am greeted today. My father has said many wise words already and I don't hope to match them, so I won't bore you with my prattle. Rather, let us celebrate and make sure the efforts of the cooks do not go to waste." The feast was glorious. Loki eagerly dug into the dozens of dishes on offer and drank until he felt himself begin to lose control of his sensibilities. After the snap, the loss of millions of workers and the resulting political instability had disrupted most supply chains. Many basic items increased in price by orders of magnitude or disappeared altogether. Wong and Loki had never gone hungry in the sanctum, but after relying on the same few foodstuffs for months, the lack of variety had begun to grate. Once Loki couldn't swallow another mouthful, he ventured out to see the entertainment on offer and to clear the cotton wool in his head. The previous night, at the feast to mark the eve of Thor's coronation, there had been a skilled bard and a troupe of lithe dancers from Jotunheim on hand to entertain the gathered. Today, there were easily a dozen bards and dance groups on show. The festivities stretched out far beyond the Great Hall, to the courtyards of the palace and down to the streets of the city itself. Loki made an unhurried loop of the courtyards, stopping to amuse himself at a lewd puppet show and to cringe at a duo on harps, who were reciting a mangled tale of Loki and Thor's early exploits. At the fifth mention of Loki's fierce orbs, his patience reached Ned to head back inside the palace. Before he was halfway there, however, he spotted Thor and his usual quartet of hangers-on at the edge of a broad square. The palace guard typically used this space for their training sessions. Today it had been repurposed into an arena for dancing. A group of musicians were playing a lively tune and there were at least a dozen pairs dancing, yet Thor's voice boomed over them all. "You must dance with me," he proclaimed. After a moment, he added, "Nonsense, Lady Dagny, I'm sure you're as graceful on the dance floor as a swan is in water." Loki slipped past the revelers charring idly around the edges of the dance area. Thor's cheeks were flushed and his gait was a little unsteady as he took a step towards the mortified-looking Lady Dagny. He had left his hammer somewhere, but he still held onto their father's spear and in fact, seemed to be using it to help him stand without swaying. Loki marveled, it took many pints to achieve such results. But then today he'd had time enough to be drunk thrice over. The festivities had begun early in the afternoon and now the sun was beginning to set. "My king," Lady Dagny stammered out, "please forgive me. As much as it shames me to admit it, I am a poor dancer." "Nonsense, my lady," Thor replied, again too loudly. "Lady Sif, will you hold on to Gungnir?" Both women recognized the futility of resistance. With bewildered eyes, Sif shifted her goblet into her left hand and accepted the spear from Thor. Dagny, for her part, let Thor whisk her away into the flurry of dancing couples. In a way, Loki could see what Thor was trying to do. Lady Dagny was petite and flaxen-haired, just about the exact type that tended to draw Thor's eye. She was also painfully shy. As a child, she had often danced with her older sisters and her natural grace had been obvious even to Loki and Thor, who at the time had been barely more than children themselves. But now that her older sisters were married off and Dagny was at an age where she was expected to dance with men, she tended to hug the edges of the room. She met any proposal for a dance with wide, startled eyes and a shuddered refusal. Thor was merely attempting to draw her out of her shell. He was just being a boor about it. Sweet mercy, I near forgot what he could be like. Frowning, Loki shifted over to Sif. "Let me take the spear." She was all too eager to be rid of it, but then she cocked her head and offered him a sly half-grin. "Why so sour, Loki? Having second thoughts about those horns?" In fact, Loki'd had second, third and fourth thoughts about the horned helmet currently adorning his head, both in this timeline and the previous. The helmet had been a product of cringe-worthy insecurity. Having decided that his lithe frame would never match Thor's or Odin's broad shoulders, Loki had decided to at least make sure he looked as tall as possible. He now paid a steep price for his vanity. Unless the helmet was positioned at the exact right angle, it pinched the top of his ears and the weight of it inevitably led to a headache. And, above all, he looked like a gilded grasshopper. Not that Loki was about to share his honest thoughts with Sif. Out of Thor's 4 closest friends, she had always been the most unpalatable and had caused Loki the most trouble. He offered Sif the most charming he could summon. "I'm not sour, I'm sad. For you that is. You spent half your life pining for him and you still haven't caught on. He's not interested in you. Were you not Thor's brother," she sneered, "I would." "The king's brother," Loki retorted and sent a covert spell towards Sif's goblet. It was one they were both familiar with. Loki had discovered Sif's hatred for crickets back when they were still drilling with wooden weapons. He waited for Sif's indignant shriek, but it didn't come. Sif snorted and shaking her head, walked away. Loki tracked her retreat until the crowd swallowed all traces of her. Had she put some protection on the goblet? Surely not. Sif detested magic and thought it the coward's way out. She wouldn't resort to it unless her life was at stake. Was it the spell then? But it was an easy one. Loki had mastered it about the same time he learned basic arithmetic. And now that he thought about it, despite the healing spell he had worked hours ago when he had been readying himself for the coronation ceremony, there was still a nagging ache in his shoulder. If there was something off about his magic, he needed to find out exactly what. Loki pushed through the crowds, muttering half-hearted excuses, until he was back at the entrance hall of the palace. From there he turned in the opposite direction to the clamor and gleam of the great hall, then hurried up the side stairs up to the second floor. "Loki," Odin called out. Loki froze in mid-step, suddenly all too aware that he still held Gungnir in his hand. Sheepishly, he trudged over to the second floor landing where Odin stood, the man's expression inscrutable. "Will you take this?" Loki thrust out the spear towards his father. "Thor wanted to dance. I don't know what to do with it." Odin took Gungnir from him, but his eyes never strayed from Loki. "Your mother said you have been unwell." And right now Loki longed to tell his father that he still felt ill and was about to retire to his quarters. Odin would let him go and Loki would have the evening to investigate what precisely was going on with his magic. But it would only be a matter of time until his mother heard he was ill, claiming illness again. She would descend upon him with at least a trio of healers in tow. What if the healers noticed he was not the Loki who had originally occupied this body? No, he couldn't risk this discovery. What then to tell his father? Now that they were alone, there was much he wanted to discuss with Odin. He had more or less come to terms with his true parentage after a number of bitter years, but nagging questions remained that Odin had never deigned to answer. As for Hela, Loki had 100 questions about her. However, he couldn't just ask outright, not without giving some account of how he had come by such knowledge. Besides, this did not feel like a night for hard questions. It was a celebration after all, and truthfully, his father looked weary already. "I do feel better now, father," Loki replied, uncertain if Odin would find it odd how long it had taken him to come up with an answer. "It's just, I find myself lost in thoughts. Tonight marks a new beginning for Thor. I had to question what this means for me." Odin motioned for Loki to follow him, which brought a quiet smile to Loki's face. Perhaps it was the fact he spent so much of his time seated and nearly motionless upon his throne. But Odin had always preferred to walk as he conversed. Loki fell in step with his father and they walked along the long gallery that overlooked the eastern side of the city. "I believe one day Thor will be a great king," Odin said. "But he is still young and in need of much guidance. While I still live, I will advise him as best I can. Once I am gone, it is my hope that he will be able to rely on your good counsel." "He will," Loki replied reflexively, then sucked in a breath as he finally understood something that should have been clear to him long ago. Had his father never articulated what he was attempting to do with Thor's coronation? Or had Loki been too bull-headed to listen to what his father was saying? Looking back at it, the first time around, Loki had been so focused on the faults of his brother's personality. Odin's decision to give Thor the throne of Asgard had seemed ludicrous. But Odin had not been looking at the faults of his firstborn son, but at his potential, and was presently trying to smooth over the transition period. Better to guide his son through the first difficult days of his kingship as his advisor than to cling on to power until death took him and leave a grief-stricken Thor to muddle through on his own. And he was right. I saw with my own eyes the king Thor became. Certainly, a better king than I'd been. Thaki couldn't just let the matter drop as if he were the vision of a dutiful son. His younger self would have pouted and Loki was concerned a sudden personality change in him would raise alarm. "You told us, and more than once, that we were both born to be kings," Loki said. Odin glanced back at his youngest. "Do you wish to be king in Thor's place?" "Most definitely not." As his fingers shed the warm hues of his Asgardian coloring, Loki pressed his lips into a thin line. If the vivid blue that replaced the familiar, comforting tones of pink and yellow wasn't discomforting enough, Loki could feel the flesh under his skin itch as his fingernails thickened and raised lines emerged over his knuckles. He supposed he ought to have been glad his true form was no longer marred with badly healed burns, but in truth, even now, every moment Loki spent with his true form exposed left his stomach crawling with unease. But how much was it costing him to keep his true face hidden day in and day out? Year after year, century after century, he had never fretted about it overly much, although for years he had suspected the sustained effort of his concealment narrowed his capabilities. In the past, he had wielded magic enough for his purposes. The time travel, however, had left its mark. After hours of trial and error, Loki had confirmed to himself that his magic remained, albeit in a crippled form. The simplest works now required thrice the effort they had taken previously, and the more complex spells eluded him entirely. Loki could only hope that this was a temporary problem. If not, he had to find other sources of strength. His magic, not his tongue or his knives, had kept him alive thus far. Without it, he was dangerously exposed. Heavy footsteps echoed around the room. He was no longer alone. Loki restored the concealment and mentally chided himself for his stupidity in exposing himself in as public a place as the palace library. Leaning back into his chair, he called out, "Thor, I'm here." He probably needn't have bothered. It was late in the evening, and with no one else about, Loki had extinguished most of the lights. The sole remaining ones were over the central passage and over the desk Loki was working at. Only a blind man would have failed to spot him. On the other hand, it made Loki feel less like a recluse to reach out to his brother so. "We missed you in the training grounds," Thor said. He dragged over a chair from one of the nearby desks and slumped into it. "You must be lost in a very fascinating project. No one's caught more than a brief glance of you in days." "Frustrating, not fascinating," Loki replied. His words were true enough. He had spent the 3 days since Thor's coronation buried under piles of books, initially from his own collection, then from the palace library. Yet any answer as to what he could do about his magic eluded Loki. Although this was infuriating, he wasn't surprised in the slightest. That was the risk with dabbling in unproven, theoretical magic. When things went awry, there were no troubleshooting manuals on hand. Thor wiped the sweat still beading on his forehead, then pushed his dust-coated hair back behind his ears. "What's this for?" "Doesn't matter," Loki said. "It was just a stray thought I had, and I'm starting to think it's not actually possible, so it might be best to just drop the matter." "Not possible? That sounds like a challenge." Loki chuckled. If he were trying to push Thor towards something, Thor had just given him the perfect opening. Another few words from Loki and Thor could be on his way to slay some mythical beast in the darkest caverns of Muspelheim. It's almost a pity. All I want is for him to drop this topic. "Magic's not your forte, Thor. Best you stay out of it." Shaking his head, Loki slammed shut the 3 books he had laid out on the table in front of him. "What about you? You've been king for 3 days now. Have you insulted any ambassadors yet?" "4 years it's been, Loki. When will you stop bringing it up?" "Well, it's not an easy thing to forget," Loki said. "Father was already beginning to preparations for your coronation. Then you go and, in about a quarter of an hour, make such a mess of things that Alfheim was ready to start a war. Spectacular work there." Thor bristled. The light elves are easily offended. I've always found them perfectly personable. Maybe if you'd made some move to help, instead of smirking and snickering at my misfortune. "Believe me, there are some things even I can't set right," Loki threw back, somewhat startled how easy it had been to stir his brother's ire. The Thor of his time hadn't been nearly so easy to bait. In fact, that Thor would have been able to extricate himself out of that awkward situation with the elves with a modicum of grace, not dig himself in further until he had insulted not only the ambassador's wife, but the entire nobility of Alfheim. This, infinitely more than Thor's hair or his eyes, made obvious the vast chasm between the man Thor had been before his exile to Midgard and the man Thor had become before Thanos took him. But what had been the price that accompanied that personal growth? High, far too high. Yet Loki had to wonder, if he did manage to change things enough, sparing Thor, himself and everyone around them even a fraction of the pain the coming years could bring, what would be the trade-off? "Stop it. You've already knocked out the first variable. Second-guessing yourself now is a waste of time." Thor rose from his seat and Loki was about to bid him farewell. Thor preferred to fling about furniture, not words, so this was about the place Loki expected Thor to cut off their discussion. But Thor didn't leave. He watched Hugin and Munin dive down from the library's vaulted ceiling and circle the room, cawing in tandem. "We're under attack," Thor declared. And he was off before Loki had a chance to give voice to any of the questions on his mind. Recovering from surprise, Loki followed his brother out of the library, through 2 public halls, along several corridors and then down into the bowels of the palace. At the entrance to the weapons vault, they nearly stumbled over a guard lying motionless on the ground. Crystals of ice covered every inch of his skin and the ground around him. "Frost giants," Thor muttered. "Is this the Norns cackling at me?" While Thor stepped over the guard and strode towards the open doors to the weapons vault, Loki's gaze lingered over the frozen corpse. "The guards work in pairs," he said. "Where's the other one?" The only answer he received was a familiar whir, which sent the floor vibrating. Loki ducked down just in time to avoid being struck in the head by Mjolnir, but Thor seemed oblivious to his near fratricide. Mjolnir aloft, he burst into the vault. By the time Loki caught up to his brother, a frost giant lay dead on the floor. Unfortunately, his 2 companions seemed in perfect health and they had the second Asgardian guardsman cornered, the man's back pressed against the pillar that held the casket of ancient winters. Thor took down both frost giants with a single swing of his hammer, but rather than looking relieved, the guardsman's face paled. Loki whipped around. At least half a dozen frost giants now stood at the vault's entrance. He drew his knives and charged towards them. From the first moment, he felt he was on the back foot in this fight. They were all taller than him and their ice-forged weapons offered them a longer reach. Loki tried to get in as close as possible, so that their long limbs and swords would become a hindrance, not a help. But the tallest of the frost giants caught his arm and swung him around, sending Loki into an unused niche of the vault. "How'd they get in here?" Thor demanded. He was doing good work with the hammer, although the enclosed space limited the range of his movement. Did Heimdall let them through? Loki scrambled to his feet and launched himself at the frost giant closest to him. He found a gap in the giant's armor, sinking his knife deep into the flesh above the frost giant's hip. Loki staggered back. An injured opponent wasn't a dead one. Besides, Thor was right, they needed to find how the frost giants had gotten into Asgard. Loki's knife found its target in the neck of another giant as Loki forced his way out the vault. Making sure to keep his knives raised should someone attempt to engage him, Loki skirted around the dead Guro look around. He swore when he spotted the portal. The pillars along the passageway hid it well. It was no wonder Thor and Loki had missed it on their way in. But this portal was at the exact spot he had intended to open one during Thor's coronation. This shouldn't be happening. Someone struck him across the middle of his back with enough force to send Loki skittering forward a foot. He swerved around. A frost giant grabbed Loki's right arm and wrenched it counterclockwise until Loki's grip slackened. The knife in his hand slid out, clattering along the flagstones. "Look," the giant sneered, "I've caught myself a pretty princeling." Just as Loki was about to make use of his other knife, a second frost giant caught his left hand. This one, a female, grinned and pressed her fingers tighter around his forearm. Oh no, no fuck. Even through his thick shirt, he could feel tendrils of frost spreading out from the frost giant's hand out over his own skin. There was no need to look down either. The confused expressions of the frost giants told Loki more than he wanted to know. Thor leapt out the doors to the vault with a furious roar. Not a second later, the doors were flung off their hinges and torn into pieces in a torrent of ice. Loki recovered from the shock of seeing the casket in use faster than the frost giants. He head-butted the female one, breaking her nose. Her grip on Loki loosened, so Loki twisted out of her hold and stabbed the other frost giant in the thigh. This was hardly a fatal stroke, but it allowed Loki to slip away. Meanwhile Mjolnir whistled through the air, sending chunks of blue and white ice flying in every direction. Loki could barely see the frost giant currently wielding the casket amid the furore. Nevertheless, he couldn't stand idly by. This wasn't a weapon Thor could deal with on his own. Loki lunged forward. Just as he did so, Thor altered the direction of his swing, throwing off Loki's calculations. Loki had to awkwardly dive sideways to avoid his brother's wrath and landed far further from his target than he would have liked. "Thanks, Thor," Loki muttered as he clambered up. He struck out at the nearest target available, the giant's calf. The frost giant howled with pain and swung the casket down. Throwing his arms over his head, Loki rolled away. Just as he prepared himself for the casket's full force to come down on him, the torrent stopped. Loki lowered his hands just enough to see what's happening and found Thor standing over him with a satisfied smile on his face. "He's dead," Thor said, offering his hand to Loki. The frost giant was indeed dead. Anyone would be after Thor swung Mjolnir into their head. Loki cringed at the bloody sight. But he had to admit this had been the decisive stroke of this encounter. The casket lay idle beside the frost giant's body, and the three giants who still remained on their feet turned to flee. Loki brought his hand up to close their portal, but when he completed the incantation, nothing happened. One of the giants slipped through to the other side. "Close the portal," Thor hollered. The second frost giant reached the portal. Loki tried the spell work again. The result was the same. The remaining frost giant jumped into the portal and disappeared from view. The portal's glowing edges pulsed, then rolled in until the portal was no more. "That wasn't my doing." Loki pursed his lips, berating himself for playing around with untested spell work until Thor's disgruntled muttering startled him out of his thoughts. "The second guard didn't survive the power of the casket," Thor explained when Loki threw him a questioning look. "How many would?" Loki replied and gestured to the body of the frost giant who had wielded the casket. "How did he get to it in the first place?" "I brought him down earlier on. He wasn't as dead as I thought he would be," Thor answered curtly as he surveyed the empty space where the portal had been. "Mistakes happen. It doesn't matter now. The frost giant's dead and the casket is still in Asgardian hands." To be precise, the casket now lay on its side in the middle of the weapons vault's antechamber, amid melting ice and washes of spilled blood. Loki shifted away from it. Thor could pick the casket up and return it to its designated stand. It was bad enough the frost giants had seen Loki's true form. He didn't need to offer Thor that revelation this evening as well. "If they can open a portal into the palace, the casket isn't safe. Nor anything else in the vault," Thor replied. He seemed to give up hope of finding answers in the empty air where the portal had been and turned his attention to the bodies now scattered all around them. Loki cocked his head. "That might well be true. We could move the vault's contents to the treasury and order for the guard to be doubled throughout the palace." "That's not enough. Father would know what to do," Loki said. He didn't much care for the dark undertone in Thor's words. "Summon him." Thor started, then jerked to a stop. He crouched down beside one of the frost giants lying slumped by the door to the vault and flipped him onto his back. "This one's alive." The frost giant's thigh and shoulder bled, but his life didn't seem to be in immediate danger. Consequences of Thor's wrath aside, of course. Thor slid his fingers under the collar of the frost giant's chestpiece and lifted him off the ground. "Your name?" "Baji," the frost giant muttered. "I have questions. It'll be best for you if you answer them, and answer them well." As he spoke, Thor lifted the frost giant higher until Baji's body spasmed and he moaned with pain. Baji's armor hid the exact nature of his injuries, but Loki suspected Thor's rough handling had put additional pressure on the shoulder wound. Whether this was his intention or a happy accident, Thor gave no clue. He waited until Baji stilled, then went on. "How did you get into Asgard?" "A portal." Baji let out a strangled chuckle. "Has all the gold in this thrice-damned palace left you blind?" "Who opened the portal? How was this done?" Loki asked. "Not my place to know these things. So now you claim blindness?" Loki scoffed. "How could you not see who held the portal open for you when you came through?" "I didn't stop to look around." At that, Thor wrenched up Baji even further, until Baji was nearly eye to eye with Thor. But then Thor groaned in frustration and released his grip on the frost giant. Baji flopped to the floor and screamed as the fall jarred his injuries. Thor wasn't done, however. With a warm smile, he set Mjolnir atop the giant's solar plexus. "Think quietly for a while, my friend," he said. "I expect you will find you have more to tell me than you first thought. Call out when you're ready to talk." Loki had to make a concerted effort not to grimace at Baji's struggle to take a breath while Mjolnir's full weight rested on his chest. Even when Mjolnir hadn't been reserved for Thor's use, the weapon hadn't been an easy weight to bear, let alone to shift. Loki remembered that full well. Thudding on the stairs interrupted Thor's impromptu interrogation. Both Loki and Thor stiffened, half anticipating another fight. But it was their father, flanked by Tyr, the captain of the Einherjar, and a dozen of the palace guard. Odin wore little more than leggings and nightshirt, save for the sword at his side. The ravens are slow to forget their old ways, Odin said. They spoke of an intrusion, but I see the new king has attended to the matter. Frost giants, father. They were after the casket, Thor replied. Odin and Tyr were silent for several seconds, seemingly just taking in the scene before them. It was hardly a glorious battlefield. A dank chamber with bodies scattered all about and everywhere. Melting mounds of ice that would soon turn the whole floor into a great, red-tinted puddle. And amid all that, the great treasure of Jotunheim still lay like a discarded trinket. Guards, clear the dead, Odin said, then lifted up the casket and beckoned his sons into the weapons vault. You had best explain to Tyr and me what happened here. Thor waited until they were out of earshot of the guardsmen before he spoke. Perhaps he was still disappointed to have allowed frost giants to reach the casket. His account was brief and lackluster, all of 4 sentences. Loki then added a few words for the tale, but there was little for him to say unless he wanted the knight's focus to turn to his crippled magic or the true shade of his skin. What will you do now, Thor? Odin asked once he set the casket back to its designated place in the vault. One frost giant still lives, Thor replied. I was in the middle of questioning him when you arrived. Tyr grinned, revealing the wide gap in the upper row of his teeth where a frost giant polearm once struck him. The one writhing under the hammer. I take it. A good start, my king. I can work with him from here, he will be talking soon enough. They gave the guardsmen time to clear the space. The frost giants were carried out quickly, but as per ancient custom, the 2 dead Asgardians were wrapped in silken sheets and lifted up on ceremonial shields. They had died defending their realm. Fire and Valhalla awaited them. Once only Bagi remained, Thor called for the guardsmen to leave and lifted Mjolnir off Bagi. The frost giant gulped mouthfuls of air, his chest nearly spasming. After perhaps a dozen of these panicked breaths, Bagi must have become cognizant of his situation. He clambered backwards, away from the Asgardians peering down on him. Tyr, although only a few centuries younger than Odin, still retained the full vigor of his youth. He moved swiftly. In one deft motion, he grabbed Bagi and pulled the frost giant up. Stand, Tyr demanded. Stand upright, you miserable beast. Bagi did seem to try, but his injured leg wouldn't hold him. Within moments he collapsed to his knees and sank his head down to his chest. Tyr kicked him. Too pathetic to even stand and face your enemies. Tyr grabbed a fistful of Bagi's hair and pulled back until Bagi finally lifted his head. Pay respects to your betters, beast. Here you are before Thor, the king of Asgard and protector of the 9 realms. You are here before Odin and before me, Tyr. Bagi produced an incomprehensible grunt, which sent Tyr into laughter. Tyr leaned down and spoke into the frost giant's ear. I take it these names mean something to you. Yes, what you fear is true. I am the Tyr who took Yallir and who slaughtered the Roskvar. This is the Odin, who broke the might of Jotunheim and took the casket of ancient winters from your miserable race. Think well before you choose your next words. What do you want? I already told your king what I know, Bagi replied. While Odin seemed tired more than anything else, Thor wore an expression of stunned fascination. Loki too found himself disarmed by the scene before them. Tyr featured in countless songs and sagas, but Loki and Thor had known him primarily as the dour man whom Sif called father. The man had made a valiant stand against the dark elves before he fell, but Loki had been in Svartalheim by then and heard the tale only later. This was the first time Loki saw firsthand the Tyr the bards had sung about. I can't say I like him any better like this. Tell us about the portal, Loki said, lest Tyr go on any longer. Why? Won't change the truth, will it? Bow stand amid these great names, yet you don't even get an introduction. But there's no point introducing you, is there? I saw you try to close the portal and you couldn't. What good is a wielder who can't even do that much? Tyr glanced at Loki, then delivered a kick square to the small of Bagi's back. Tell us about the portal. I don't know anything, Bagi insisted. Lord Tyr, step back, Loki said. Bagi had to be lashing out at him because he was the only target available. Loki couldn't see what other motive there could be. Still, there was no reason he couldn't introduce himself to the frost giant. Neither Thor nor Tyr had produced results so far, perhaps Loki would. I'm Loki Odinson, Prince of Asgard, he said and conjured a circle of 4-foot-high flames around Bagi. Well met. The frost giant shrunk into himself and tried to lift himself off the floor, but Loki sent the flames higher until they licked at the ceiling. Odin and Tyr threw up their hands to shield their eyes from the fire's heat. At their feet, the puddle rapidly consuming the floor began to hiss and bubble. It was a witch. One of the women from the Brady clan, Bagi, called out over the crackling fire. Loki snuffed out the flames and inhaled deeply. After a few moments, when his vision stopped swimming and the tremors in his hands calmed, he motioned for Bagi to continue. What else? My prince commanded us to go with him, so we did. Bagi wiped off the rivulets of sweat running down his face. I don't know anything more. Your prince? Thor asked. Hellblindy. Odin's eye narrowed. Laufey's boy? Yes. Laufey's son? His brother? Loki had heard of Hellblindy before. In the last years before Ragnarok, news seldom had come from Jotunheim. Since the realm remained hostile to Asgard and neither Loki nor anyone else among the Asgardians hungered to interfere in frost giant politics, Loki had never paid much attention, but Hellblindy had featured frequently in those snippets of information. He had led a number of influential tribes in the civil war that Laufey's death had instigated. Yet Loki never realized they were related. Were the poor sources or his own inattention to blame, or had Hellblindy himself chosen to forsake his father's name? You can never know now, can you? Did the prince escape? Odin asked, inching towards Bagi. No, came Bagi's sullen reply. Odin's shoulders sunk and in that moment the long centuries of his life seemed to catch up with him. And now Laufey has cause for fury beyond measure, he sighed. All fathers give us strength. Or perhaps this is settled. Hellblindy made an assault on Asgard and paid for it. Laufey now knows for certain that our strength outmatches his, Loki said. He hoped his words sounded sincere, because they certainly weren't. This whole affair felt like a beginning of something, not an ending. In the muddled swirl of thoughts in his mind, one drew forth again and again. This isn't what fixed looks like. No, the frost giants have violated the peace between our realms, Thor said. How can I let that go unpunished? They walked right into the palace. They got to the casket itself. Do not allow your anger to forget the profits diplomacy can bring, Odin replied. It is too late for diplomacy. Tyr half-heartedly kicked Bagi in the side. They have already declared war. Odin shook his head. No, Thor cut in. The frost giants have no respect for peace treaties. They only came to heal because you and Tyr made them. Now you're king no longer and they think I'm a weakling. They don't know me and they don't respect me, so they try their luck. The only way we can have peace is to show them I'll not hesitate to strike them down whenever they give me cause to do so. Loki bit down on the inside of his cheek. This was all too familiar. Worse yet, this time Tyr beamed an encouraging smile at his young king. Chances were, any arguments Odin could make against war, Tyr would counter. The old war-hound itched for another chance at glory. How do you plan to strike them down then? Loki asked, then paused. We have what we need from the frost giant, don't we? Best not have him listening in on this. Quite right. Tyr whistled, then hollered so loudly he likely woke half the palace servants. Guards, attend to the prisoner and take him down to the cells. 4 guards rushed in. 2 grabbed Bagi's arms and dragged him out, while the other 2 trailed behind, their spears pointed at Bagi's back. They moved quickly, but Loki still caught the fear in their eyes. It had been centuries since frost giants had last been seen in Asgard. Well, Thor, have you a plan? Loki pressed. Or do you simply intend to march out to Jotunheim and hammer them into submission? Thor jerked his head towards Mjolnir. The Einherjar and my hammer should more than suffice. I could have a regiment ready by tomorrow, Tyr said. Oh, good, Loki replied dryly. Thor, declare war if you so wish. You are the king now and we have a duty to obey. However, don't act like a child and stomp about because someone dared to displease you. Think as a king and as a warrior. Once you do, the matter is quite clear. It is dangerous to leave your rear vulnerable to further attack. Odin nodded to his youngest. A witch has opened a portal almost directly into the weapons vault, which holds the most valuable collection of relics in this half of the galaxy. Who is to say she cannot open another portal into Asgard, either in the same location or elsewhere? It would be unwise to take the Einherjar into Jotunheim and leave Asgard unprotected. What was this portal then, Loki? I don't recount frost giants being able to enter the palace so freely before, Thor said. The spell is common enough. The location, as you said, less so. Loki paused to weigh up how much he wanted to reveal. It isn't easy to open a portal between the realms ordinarily. I think, and this is the roughest of theories only, I think this is the first sign of the approaching convergence. The boundaries between the realms have begun to weaken, making portals easier to create. It may be this area down by the vault is a particularly sensitive fracture point. How many more there are, I have no clue. Thor made a mock swing with Mjolnir. Norns be damned. Fine, until we have a solution for these portals. We'll have a regiment of the Einherjar in the palace to supplement the guard and another regiment out patrolling the city. A third will come with me to Jotunheim. I want them ready by tomorrow. I cannot have that many men ready by then, Tyr replied, not without stripping the outer villages. Which we cannot do, because a portal might open up anywhere, Thor finished for him. Tyr sighed. My king, give me 4 days and you shall have your soldiers. Fine, Thor groaned. Go then and start your work, Tyr. Excuse me? A guard interjected during the brief pause in Loki and Frigga's discussion. Once they turned to the guard, however, his courage failed him and Frigga had to prompt the man to continue. I just thought the king might be found here, your highness, the guard explained. The captain just wanted to report that the vault has been emptied and everything has been relocated to the treasury. The man looked somewhat bewildered, which Loki supposed was justified. It was a rare day when the council chamber was filled with sorcerers rather than the king's counselors. But Thor, Tyr and Odin had left to inspect the first contingent of the Einherjar arriving to protect the palace, leaving the chamber vacant. Loki and Frigga saw no reason not to make use of the space in their absence. They were in need of a map and there were none better than the one in this chamber. Thank you, Alder, Frigga said. I will pass on the message to my son. Was there anything else? The guard began to shake his head, then thought better of it. Do you know what is to happen with the bodies? Prepare them for a warrior's funeral, of course. The frost giants too? The guard's eyes widened. Ah, that had. Loki rested his hair arm. I'll look into the matter. In the furore of the night, he hadn't had the chance to spare a thought about the frost giant bodies and apparently, no one else had either. What had his father ordered to be done with the 3 troublemakers from Thor's coronation the first time around? Loki couldn't recount. He had been too focused on Thor at that moment. What then was the appropriate disposal method? He couldn't well leave it to Thor, not in the mood Thor was in. Nor did Loki want rotting corpses lying about in the palace. On the other hand, Asgardian sensibilities had to be considered. Where were the bodies moved to? I would see them before I make a decision, Loki said, hoping that inspiration would strike soon. The guard looked somewhat put out at the request, but took Loki down to the dungeons where an unused cell had been repurposed as a morgue. The frost giants, 9 in all, were laid out in a row atop sheets of undyed canvas. As Loki moved along the line of the dead, the guard spoke. I'd not trouble yourself overly much about the bodies, your highness. After all, no matter the method we use to be rid of them, it'll never match what their own families would have done. Pardon, I think it was Isinger the Blind who spoke of it. The man's cheeks flushed. It wasn't the place of a guard to school a prince of Asgard on history. But other chronicles too. They feed the dead to their children. Loki grimaced. Yes, I rather suspect the palace cooks can furnish the dining table with more palatable meat than Jotun. The guard laughed and Loki threw up his hand to dismiss him. Isinger had indeed written about cannibalism among frost giants. But Isinger had also claimed that the old king boar had bedded 99 virgins in a single night. Can't say there's much meat on any of you anyway, Loki muttered under his breath as he inspected the rest of the bodies. The last frost giant in the line wore different armor to the rest. It hugged its wearer in a way only custom-made armor could and gleamed in the torchlight, elaborate revealing images of strange animals etched into the chest and shoulder pieces. Their leader then. Hellblindy. Loki hadn't noticed it back at the weapons vault, but Hellblindy was shorter than the others. Was short stature the lot of Laufey's line or had Hellblindy simply not yet grown to his full height? Loki didn't actually know which of them was older. Someone had turned Hellblindy's head so that the damage to the back of his head wasn't so obvious and his passive, stiff face now stared up at Loki. There didn't seem to be much resemblance between them. Hellblindie clearly took after Laufey, while Loki favored his mother, whoever she had been. If Odin knew her identity, he had never volunteered the information and Loki had never dared to ask. Now he had to wonder, was he a full-blood brother to Hellblindie or merely a half-brother? Either way, the point was moot. The Norns had decreed a battle between Thor and Hellblindie. Thor had won. That was the end of it. Except that wasn't true. Loki had meddled with history, he had a hand in this. I traded one brother for another. Running his hand through his tangled hair, Loki sighed. He was dwelling too long on a dead Jotun with whom he had never exchanged so much as a word. There were more important issues to deal with. By the time he caught up to the guard out in the corridor, Loki had an order ready. Have their bodies cared for as if they were Asgardian and then kept in stasis, he said. Chances are the king will make use of the bodies later. It took an hour of trying to make sense of contradictory directions before Loki found the cell where Bajie was being held. Confusion reigned in the palace. The permanent guardsmen and the supplementary Einherjar presently stationed at the palace were squabbling over who had precedence in the chain of command and the exact boundaries of their jurisdictions. Thor, meanwhile, was too busy debating Tyr on the best strategy for an assault on Jotunheim to notice the turmoil. For his part, Loki was almost glad to find himself in a dusty tunnel that wound around the palace's foundations. There were fewer people to contend with down here, all of 2 guards in the middle of a card game. They snapped to attention upon Loki's approach and waited for orders, their eyes drifting towards the covered tray in Loki's hands. Is this where the frost giant is being held? Loki asked. He received eager nods from both guards. I wish to speak to him. Certainly, the older of the guards said. He unlocked the cell to the left of him. The cell was as antiquated as the rest of this wing. No projected barriers, no lamps. Only a coarse, windowless wall and iron beams to make up the other 3 sides. An unusually low ceiling too. Bajie had to hunch when he stood. Loki suspected this was the sole reason Bajie was being kept in this half-abandoned section of the palace. Tyr, like Sif, delighted in these sorts of petty victories. Were your injuries attended to? Loki asked as he set the tray down on the cell's flimsy table. Bajie grunted and, limping somewhat, moved a few steps closer to Loki, which Loki was thankful for. The cell lacked light. Only the guards' lamps out in the corridor provided illumination. Now that he was closer, Loki could see edges of bandages peering out from beneath Bajie's loose shirt. I thought you wouldn't refuse some extra food. Loki lifted the lid off the tray. Steam rose up, drowning the cell in the sweet aroma of roasted venison and root vegetables cooked with a generous amount of herbs. The meal had been intended for Loki. His mother knew he often skipped meals while he worked, so she ordered food to be brought to him whether he had asked for it or not. Still hot, Bajie remarked, a simple heating spell. Bajie's lips twitched with distaste, but he picked up a chunk of venison and bit into it. What do you want? I suppose, nothing, would sound insincere? Loki replied. There was an art to getting information out of a prisoner. Thanos' acolytes had known it well. Loki, however, had spent the past 2 days buried in musty books and had nothing to show for it. He lacked the patience to play games. I want you to tell me about the Brady. Bajie sunk into the lone chair in the cell, then picked up the fork and tried the vegetables. No wonder you Asgardians grow fat and spoiled. He slid his tongue over his lower lip, then went on. You're planning to offer me something in exchange. I take it, sweeter food, a better cell, other such luxuries. The Prince of Asgard must be the kindest man in the 9 realms. Or I can throw you into a dark pit and order the guards to stop feeding you altogether. It was a poor move to bring a fork in here, Bajie said after a moment's pause. Loki shrugged. I didn't come here unarmed. I can't wield in here, you can? Try me and you'll find out. Bajie's forehead creased, but rather than lunge at Loki, he speared another piece of venison and shoved the meat into his mouth. That was a relief. All cells in the palace had warding on them, but Loki wasn't sure what had been used for this lot of cells. Considering the present state of his magic, he could well have walked into a fully warded cell and not noticed the wards bind his powers. On the other hand, Bajie might be waiting for the right opportunity to strike. The fork had been a bad oversight. Do you have a family? Loki asked in an effort to defuse the situation. That's not your concern, one way or another. Loki sighed. The last 2 days had been an exercise in frustration. He wanted to be out with the other teams of sorcerers working to map out where the boundaries between the 9 realms grew thin. But his magic was too weak for such intensive work. He wanted to learn more about Jotun sorcery, but the Asgardian libraries possessed all of 3 books on the subject. Now Baji refused to cooperate. I tried to be civil, but I seemed to be getting nowhere, Loki said. He rested his hands on the edge of the table, making it tilt slightly, and leaned forward so he was within Baji's striking distance. Before I send for Tyr and his men to do their work on you, one more chance. You tell me what you know and I'll arrange for a more comfortable cell for you, and if you do have a family, I'll have a message sent to Jotunheim letting them know you're alive. Right now, they have no reason not to think you dead, do they? How generous, Baji said. You must have great need of me. The Brady, Baji. Our scholars say they are a clan gone extinct even before the wars began. So how can one of them be opening a portal for you now? The frost giant gritted his teeth for a long moment before he answered. Near extinct. A few remained. Children who couldn't make the sacrifice. Keep talking. You don't know much at all, do you? Baji grabbed the last of the venison. The Brady were a strong clan. The best wielders came from them. Their leader was the one who created our casket. But she alone couldn't give it the power it needed, so she and all the wielders of the Brady clan poured themselves into the casket. Only those too young to wield remained. And those children would be grown by now, their children too. Sigrun, the one who opened the portal for us, is young, but she's said to have rediscovered many secrets of her forebears. She's making a name for herself in Laufey's hall. Baji snickered. And some have said Hellblindy had his father's weakness for Brady women. Loki raised his eyebrows. Laufey's wife is Brady? No, both his wives came from warrior clans. His lover was Brady, Baji replied and flung the fork down back onto the tray. Does that satisfy you? I want to sleep. Satisfy? Loki bit back a laugh. Baji just opened the door for another 24 questions? How is the casket made? If you want to know that, you need to ask the dead. Loki found himself in a better mood the next morning. Tyr had finally reined in his squabbling lieutenants, so there was an air of order in the palace again. And while a great deal of work remained in the mapping of areas affected by the convergence, under Frigga's direction, the Asgardian sorcerers had at least now hammered out the methodology for the process. For the first time since Loki had traveled back, he and his parents had an opportunity to eat breakfast together. Thor hadn't joined them, but then he rarely did. Sometimes he liked to sleep in after a late night. More often, he woke up with the dawn and after snatching a quick breakfast from the kitchens, headed to the training grounds where he could be found until the sun was high in the sky. Still, even with Thor absent, Loki relished this private family time. While they ate, Frigga fretted over the state of her garden and with an indulging smile, talked about the budding romance between 2 of her handmaids. Odin, in turn, talked about his desire to enjoy his days now that Thor held Gingnir. He wanted to take Sleipnir out to the mountains and revisit the wild trails he had enjoyed in his youth. When he asked if Loki would be interested in accompanying him, something snapped within Loki. He supposed there had been moments like these in Frigga and Odin's last years, but Loki, either lost to the wilds of the universe or locked in Asgard's dungeons, hadn't been privy to them. I'd love to, he muttered as he threw up his hands to cover his expression. He made a show of rubbing his eyes and faked a yawn. Not his best work, but it would suffice. Pardon, I was up late last night. But the Norns had never been kind to Loki and his hour of peace drew to a close when Tyr Thor. The king is gone, Tyr declared. His beard was untrimmed and cheeks flushed scarlet. He turned for a moment, then pushed out in front of him a mortified-looking Einar, one of the younger sorcerers assisting with the portal research. Thor took my daughter, a squadron of my men and those 3 idiot friends of his into Jotunheim last night. Frigga sucked in a breath while Loki swore. What possessed him to do that? Loki asked once the curses flying out of his mouth began repeating themselves. I'm guessing by your manner, Lord Tyr. You knew nothing of this. Why is that? You're the king's military advisor. Tyr's brows knotted together. We quarreled last night. Thor left in a sour mood, but I didn't anticipate he would do this. I should have. It appears we all underestimated my son's temper, Odin said. He set down his mug and drummed his fingers against the tabletop. What part did the sorcerer play in this? Tyr nudged Einar forward. Thor, Einar shuddered and planted his eyes firmly on his shoes. The king approached me while I was working late in the library last night. He was looking for his brother, but the prince was nowhere to be found. Disappointed, he was about to leave, but then he asked me if I could open a portal for him. I said I could. So he ordered me to do it. The one near the weapons vault? Odin asked. Yes. Bloody F. Loki cut himself off when Frigga threw him a reproachful look. He took a moment to try to strip away the venom on his tongue before he spoke again. You didn't think to tell anyone that the king left Asgard? He forbid me to. He told me they would all return by morning, but then it was morning and I became worried, so I went to find someone who could help, but Lord Tyr already knew. Tyr let out a derisive snort. Does he think me incompetent? As if I wouldn't notice my men missing. It took you long enough though, didn't it? Loki replied. Where were you last night, your highness? Perhaps your tongue would have produced a miracle my counsel wouldn't, of course, you only ever. I had questions for the frost giant. Loki said. Question his guards if you will. You will find nothing untoward in my behavior. On the other hand, you, Lord Tyr, have done nothing other than salivate at the prospect of a new war with the Jotunheim. Enough! Odin shouted and everyone in the room froze. Tyr, ready your men. Frigga, have the sorcerers on alert for any intrusions. Loki, come with me. We need to consult with Heimdall. Are you aware my son went to Jotunheim? Odin asked. Without waiting for Heimdall's answer, he went on. Do you see Thor now? Heimdall stared at Loki. The staring in itself wasn't new. The interactions between Heimdall and Loki had at times been less than amicable, and yet, he had never looked at Loki quite like that. Distaste, repulsion, anger. All that was familiar. Fascination wasn't. Great. One more complication I don't need. Loki nudged his head towards the opening to the Bifrost. Odin's mind was on Thor at the present, but unless Heimdall managed to tear his eyes away from Loki, even Odin was bound to notice Heimdall's behavior. Thankfully, Heimdall seemed to remember himself. He turned his back to Asgard's gleaming towers and peered out into the endless murk of the universe. Silence stretched until Loki could almost hear his own heartbeat. I feel his life force, Heimdall said at last. Yet I cannot see him. It is strange. There is a veil on him. Where there should be light there is only darkness, and what sound seeps through the veil offers me no clues about Thor's location. What of his companions? 20 of the Einherjar went with him, so did the warriors 3 and Lady Sif. Odin pressed. His words sounded calm, but Loki stood next to his father and he couldn't avoid noticing the way Odin's hands refused to still. I see Lady Sif and the warriors 3. Heimdall turned back around to face Odin and Loki. 4 Asgardian soldiers are with them. They are lost amid wood and snow, but fear and grief drive them on. And Thor isn't with them? Loki asked. I cannot see him, so I cannot say for certain. Thank you, Heimdall, Odin said. Loki looked to his father in hope of answers. Heimdall could be fooled. Loki knew a couple of ways to hide himself from Heimdall's eyes, but what the man had described with Thor sounded different. Was Thor injured, fallen prey to some Jotun weapon? Fear and grief and a mere 4 soldiers where there should have been 20 suggested something dark had taken place. Too many unknowns here, Odin spoke softly. Meanwhile, Tyr still needs more time to ready his men. Do we need more Einherjar in Jotunheim? Loki replied. The numbers Thor took with him is not so far from the strength Helblindi brought into Jotunheim. There is a sense of proportionality. An army sends a different message. Odin adjusted the edge of his eye patch. I am glad at least one child of mine is not eager to settle every problem with sword and spear. However, I fear, one way or another, blood will flow today. Heimdall, send a message to Lord Tyr to continue the preparations in our absence. Loki and I will go to Jotunheim. Listen for our voices on the winter winds. Heimdall jerked his head in agreement and lifted Hofund, the great sword he used to open the Bifrost. While Heimdall readied the Bifrost mechanism, Loki squared his shoulders and checked the straps on his armor. This wasn't a surprise. He had tried to be optimistic over the past 3 days, but ever since he first saw the frost giants in Asgard, a trip to Jotunheim had seemed an inevitability sooner or later. Loki was glad that at least his father was with him. The Bifrost spun open before them, flooding the world with more colors than any eye could ever perceive. Odin remounted Sleipnir and led him onto the bridge. Loki hurried to his own horse. But the chestnut was still young and lacked Sleipnir's experience. He balked at the Bifrost's light and fury. It took several reassuring neighs from Sleipnir and Loki promising a large bag of sugar when they returned before Iro finally moved forward. Heimdall set them down in a narrow clearing surrounded by haggard pines and larches, all heavily laden with fresh snow. A storm must have just passed. Stray snowflakes still danced in the air and dark clouds hung in the distance. "Is this place as miserable as you remember it, father?" Loki asked. Odin's mouth twitched and he brushed away the snowflake that had got caught in his eyebrow. "Best we move." The Bifrost had burned through the foot of snow that carpeted the ground, revealing the dead grasses and ochre mud beneath. Loki and Odin nudged their horses out onto the unmelted snow on the clearing's edge. Within seconds, Loki was certain the horses would be more a hindrance than a help. The deep powder masked the unevenness of the ground beneath. It was too easy for the horses to stumble over a stray boulder and break a limb. "Allfather, Loki," a familiar voice disturbed the wood's frosty silence, then Volstagg emerged from the tree line. "Norns be praised. But come, we shouldn't be out in the open." Leaning on his axe as he walked and with clumps of snow hanging from his beard like garlands, Volstagg led them to rest of the Asgardians. Snow coated their clothes and armor. Every inch of exposed flesh was flushed and beginning to blister. Two of the Einherjar walked with their comrades slung between them. The injured soldier barely had their strength to keep his feet moving, let alone to greet the newcomers. Fandral looked little better. The front of his armor was sticky with blood and a large gash ran from his right eyebrow to his chin. Hogun, even more resolute than usual, kept him steady. Sif and the last Einherjar soldier brought up the rear of the party. "Where is Thor?" Loki asked. When Sif and the warriors three exchanged uneasy glances but didn't produce a word, Loki grabbed Volstagg's beard and pulled the man towards him. "Where the hell is my brother?" Volstagg's eyes widened and he stammered out his response. Capture demanded. "Start at the beginning and explain all of this." Loki let go of Volstagg's beard, sending the man stumbling back. He produced an incomprehensible series of stammers until Sif cut him off. "Respectfully, Your Highness," she said. "We need to keep moving until we can find shelter. From what I remember of my father's words, there were caves where one could take shelter a few miles to the northeast." "Surely even you can talk while you walk, out with it," Loki replied. On any other day Sif would have glared at him. Today she kept her eyes on the snow at her feet. "Thor found us at the training grounds last night. He was incensed about how my father kept wasting his time talking about supply trains and such. Thor said he could achieve just as much without 1,000 Einherjar soldiers slowing him down. He wanted the four of us and you, Loki, to go with him. But you were nowhere to be found and Fandral persuaded him to at least take 20 soldiers with us. We found a sorcerer who could reopen the portal the frost giants had used to get into Asgard. It led to a cave in the hills above a village," Hogun said. Loki nodded. He remembered that village. 24 houses, most with unevenly slanted roofs, and a few farm animals in rotting pens. He had found his co-conspirators there for his plan to disrupt Thor's coronation. He hadn't thought much of them at the time, but someone in that village must have had the intelligence to make Hellblindy aware of the prize Loki had offered. In hindsight, it would have been smarter to eliminate everyone who had known about the portal when Loki decided not to follow through with the plan. "Did you enter the village?" Odin asked. "We did." Sif glanced up for a brief moment, then dropped her head again as if she didn't dare chance meeting Odin's gaze. "That's where it went wrong. They were waiting for us." "There had to have been at least 60 of them," Fandral added. The injured Einherjar soldier's foot caught something, nearly sending him and the two men helping him face first into the snow. Loki dismounted and motioned towards Iro. The party could only travel at the pace of their slowest member. They might as well put the worst of the injured atop the horse. Loki could walk and make sure Iro didn't misstep and injure himself. "Sif, get on with your account," he said while he helped the soldiers get their injured comrade into the saddle. She sucked in a breath and went on. "At first it was a heavy fight, but not the worst odds we've seen. Then, I still don't quite understand it, but then a young-looking female appeared. She grabbed Thor's hand and he collapsed like all life had been stripped out of him. A pack of frost giants seized him and bore him away before any of us could get to him. We went after him, but it was no use. They wouldn't let us anywhere near him. That's when the Einherjar took the heavy casualties. We had to retreat. Odin closed his eyes and drew his head back until he stared up at Jotunheim's lukewarm sun. Loki will feast tonight. Do you? Sif seemed to recognize that this wasn't the time to bother Odin with questions, so she hesitantly reached out to Loki. He is still alive, isn't he? Loki pulled away from Sif's hand. Heimdall could sense him, but he couldn't tell us where Thor is. The Norns bless us, not all is lost, Volstagg said. Bless you? Loki sneered. The Norns would do well to spit in your eye, Volstagg. In fact, all of you. You follow my brother about like you are moths drawn to his flame. Always encouraging the worst in him. One night I'm not around to talk him out of idiocy, one night. And come morning, we have this disaster. Wonderful, fucking wonderful. What was your plan here anyway? Did you bother to ask Thor what his plan was? Because I can't see what it could have been. For one, we still don't know if Loki ordered the attack or if Hellblindy made the move on his own volition. Even if Loki is responsible, did you really think he would just let you walk into his house unchallenged? Or did you not think at all? Was it just a vague idea that you would smack about any frost giants who happened to get in your way? No one had an answer for him, which only left Loki more incensed. So it was to be random mayhem in that village. He snarled. How does that make you different to a marauder? Loki, Odin said quietly, now is not the time for anger. When is? Glaring, Loki looked up to his father. His breath hitched. All color had drained from Odin's face and his mouth hung half open in dismay. Honestly, Odin had looked healthier while dying. Father, remember Heimdall's words, Thor's lives, Loki muttered. A familiar, ugly jealousy stirred in the pit of Loki's stomach. Odin loved him as his own. Loki knew that. But a small voice still screamed out. Would his father look so stricken had Thor and Loki's places been exchanged? It was a struggle not to indulge that instinct. Odin attempted a smile, but managed only a cold grimace. Hellblindy is dead, by Thor's hand. We will find shelter soon, Sif said. We'll rest through the night. In the morning, we will get Thor back. Loki clenched Ero's rein, but swallowed the biting answers he had for Sif. He had said enough already. Anything more would be self-indulgent and unproductive. What then was the productive move? The Asgardians were in need of a healer or two. They hardly looked ready to take on frost giants once more. On the other hand, Loki had no reason to treat Thor gently. The longer they waited, the longer Thor had to endure Loki's wrath and the harder it would be to track where Thor had been taken. Perhaps this was that time, which came once in a century or so, when Sif was right. They needed to find a safe place and regroup. An arrow whistled through the air. Ero reared up with a wild roar, ripping his reins out of Loki's hand and sending the injured soldier flying out of the saddle. Before the Asgardians could even duck down, more arrows came down on them. So much for shelter and safety. Loki threw himself onto the ground and threw up a rough shielding spell over the Asgardians. He was too slow to catch all the arrows. Someone screamed. In reply, another volley of arrows whistled towards the Asgardians. Come and fight us face to face, cowards, Fandral shouted, drawing his rapier. Loki drew his own knives and tried to make sense of the situation while his shielding spell gave him the opportunity to do so. Odin had caught Ero's reins and was trying to bring the horse under control. The injured soldier was on the ground, but he was moving. The rest of the Einherjar kept close to Odin. Fandral, Hogun and Volstagg were crouched down, eager for a fight. Which left Sif. Shit. She was slumped on the ground a mere 3 feet behind Loki, one arrow shaft protruding from her left arm and another from the base of her neck. Trembling, Sif held her right hand over the neck wound, but blood ran freely down her fingers. Loki scrambled over to her. Another volley of arrows descended on his shield. Had the arrows come from a single direction, Loki wouldn't have been concerned. But the frost giants seemed to have surrounded them and it strained him to keep everyone protected from every angle. Loki, release the shield, Volstagg yelled. If they won't come to us, we shall come to them. Look at Sif. Loki pressed his hands against the wound on her neck. Within moments, his gloves were soaked. The blood still flows, which means the heart is still pumping. That's good. You'll be fine, Sif, he muttered, We've survived worse over the years, haven't we? Heimdall. Odin's voice boomed out. Light and color descended upon them. Loki released the shielding spell when he felt the Bifrost's pull and surrendered to it. The Jotnar sent a volley of arrows in farewell. Their hiss died just as Loki glimpsed Asgard in the distance and released a breath of relief. He landed awkwardly, but kept his hands firm around the shaft in Sif's neck. He was vaguely aware there was commotion in the Bifrost Observatory. Men groaned and swore. Horseseizure. He didn't care. He focused what magic the time travel spell hadn't stripped away into slowing Sif's frantic heartbeat. Heimdall, Loki called out, she needs a healer. No reply came. Loki glanced up. Everyone else in the observatory stood in a tight circle at the bottom of the dais in the observatory's center. Hogun shifted his weight from one foot to another, opening up a gap between himself and Fandral. Loki could see the edge of a red cloak through that gap. Only one of them had worn anything red today. Loki swallowed the lump in his throat and gave voice to the question he desperately didn't want answered. What's wrong with my father? This is how my son died, Tyr said. In the last few hours, Tyr's voice had taken on a softness that Loki had never known the man to possess. He used a cool cloth to wipe the sweat on Sif's face and straightened the blanket Sif's last seizure had left askew. Not exactly like this. No, his company became cut off and thus unable to take their injured to a field hospital, let alone back to Asgard. The poison took him as he lay in a dark cave, without so much as a fire to give him comfort in his final hours. Loki pressed his palms together, uncertain about what response Tyr wanted from him. Ove, Sif's brother, wasn't a topic one raised within Tyr's earshot. As best as Loki understood it from snatches of whispered conversations and from Sif's few words on the matter, Ove's early death left Tyr to bury all the ambitions he had held for his house. In the first few centuries, Tyr had hoped for another son, but the Norns saw fit to offer him 3 daughters in Ove's stead. After Sif's birth had nearly robbed him of his wife too, Tyr had to admit defeat. Tyr's family had long amused Loki. Sif always striving to become the son she could never be. Tyr's simmering resentment that she would even attempt such a charade. And Sif's older sisters perpetually attempting to force a peace between the two. It wasn't so amusing now. Well over a millennium has passed and, unlike her brother, Sif is in the care of the best healers in Asgard, Loki said. Tyr threw him a condescending smile. Does she look to be improving? She didn't. The arrow wounds themselves were serious injuries, but the poison on the arrowheads turned out to be the true calamity. The first symptoms had appeared in hours after their return to Asgard, once the poison had a chance to spread throughout Sif's body. A fever came. Within an hour it was severe enough to spark seizures. Then Sif's organs began to suffer. The healers propped up her vital functions, but they struggled to bring down the fever and they could do nothing about the grotesque spider webs of gray spreading over Sif's skin. How is it that after the long years Asgard and Jotunheim have been at war, we don't have a cure for this? Loki asked. Sighing, he leaned against the windowsill and tried his best to ignore the sun creeping up from behind the mountains. Healers say the poison is never the same, Tyr replied as he sunk into the wicker chair by Sif's bed. And they cannot keep a patient alive long enough to try an antidote. An intelligent strategy, I'll give the frost giants that. A coward's strategy. An honorable man doesn't resort to poison. Loki bit his lip and swallowed his instinctive reply, then reached for something more conciliatory. I'm not ready to surrender my hope for Sif's recovery, but whatever may come, I'm sorry this grief has befallen your family. She should have had many more years in this world. Despite their mutual dislike, Loki didn't have to spin his words out of nothing. Sif had been more perceptive than the rest of the Asgardians, so fearing that she would expose him, Loki had banished her from the 9 realms. She hadn't been there for Ragnarok or for the funeral pyre Thanos made of the statesman. She could well have survived Thanos' snap too. Hellblindy. Sif. Who else will find premature death because of me? Something of Loki's thoughts must have crept into his expression, because Tyr cocked his head and said, Do not doubt your father's strength, Loki. He is not as we are, he will recover. Thank you, Lord Tyr, Loki said, speaking more quickly than he meant to. Loki had no desire to discuss his father, but now that Tyr had brought up Odin's condition, Loki couldn't find a trail of thought that didn't swiftly circle back to Odin. Tyr, for his part, seemed to have nothing else to say. So they kept vigil until a healer burst into the room and disrupted their uneasy quiet. Her eyes swept over Tyr, then froze on Loki. "I thought you would be with your father, your highness. I couldn't take being in that room any longer. I came to check on Lady Sif and Lord Tyr." Loki responded after he dismissed the first 3 answers that flashed through his head as unnecessarily hostile. "I had best return now. Do make sure Lady Sif receives the best of care." All of 50 paces separated Sif's bedside from the room where Odin presently lay, but each step was a struggle. When it came to Sif, there was a fairly long chain of events connecting Loki's decision to meddle with the past and the arrows that struck her in Jotunheim. When it came to his father, Loki's culpability was far more direct. He had mistimed the moment to drop his shield. Half a second, just enough time for an arrow to find its mark before the Bifrost delivered them to the safety of Asgard. To Loki's surprise, his mother wasn't at her husband's side, but stood out in the hallway by the doors to Odin's room. "Why are you out here?" Loki quickened his pace. "Has he?" "No, your father sleeps," Frigga said. "You were gone so long, I worried. How is Sif?" Loki shook his head. "Not well." Frigga closed her eyes and muttered something under her breath, then offered Loki a reassuring smile. He struggled to match the gesture in any way. Instead, he took his mother's arm and led her back to the broad room where Odin slept. As much as he didn't want to hear the grief in Frigga's voice or see her knuckles whiten as fear left her clenching Odin's cold hand, Loki knew she needed him close at this moment. Frigga nestled herself back on the edge of Odin's bed and gestured for Loki to take the chair he had occupied through much of the night. Loki sunk into it, then peered up at his mother. "We must not lose hope," she said, more to herself than to Loki, but he nodded nonetheless. After a couple of minutes, she rested her back against the headboard and began taking out the long pins that kept her hair up. They were decorated with golden 8-pointed stars, which glimmered as they caught the light flooding into the room through the uncurtained windows. "Thor was fascinated with these when we were children," Loki said. "He would always beg you for a pin until you gave in and handed him one. Of course, he'd lose the pin or break it and come running to me, demanding I fix it." "And you did, didn't you? Otherwise, there wouldn't be a pin left," Frigga replied. She opened her hand and let the pins rest across her palm. Gathered together like this made obvious the limitations of Loki's artistry. A few of the pins had odd kinks in them and 2 stars sat angled incorrectly. "I don't know where to start to fix this," Loki sighed. He longed to start over again and think things through before he made any changes instead of allowing sentimentality to drive him. But considering the damage time travel had inflicted on him already, Loki has certain the spell would kill him should he try it a second time. The time stone meanwhile was still well protected by Strange's predecessor. Attempting to get his hands on it would be no less suicidal than the time travel spell. "Dawn always follows the night, no matter how deep the dark might seem," Frigga replied. "Your father will come back to us, your brother too." For the first time since he returned to the room, Loki's gaze drifted to his father. No seizures. No foul tentacles of poison trailing across his skin. As best as they could tell, he had fallen into an Odin sleep once the arrow struck him. Loki suspected Odin sleep had been inevitable. His father had put it off for far too long, likely a testament to his private hesitation to leave the 9 realms in Thor's hands. And if Loki's revelation about his true identity could trigger his collapse, news of Thor's capture by the frost giants certainly could too. However, the arrow complicated matters. Last time Odin had slept for 3 days, but there was no guessing how long this Odin sleep would last. Heavy footsteps outside startled Loki out of his anxiety-ridden speculation. He rose to his feet just as the doors swung open and Lord Agnar, the Chancellor of Asgard, strode in with Gungnir in his arms. Behind him, Attards positioned themselves along the hallway. Before Loki could say anything, Agnar dropped to his knees and offered Loki the spear. "Thor is captured, the line of succession falls to you," Frigga declared. "Until your brother returns, Asgard is yours." Loki let out a mirthless laugh. There was an uncomfortable sense of self-inflicted déjà vu about this moment. "Do you not believe your BR? No, mother, it's not that," Loki said quickly. "Thor lives, I'm sure of it. He is of more use to the frost giants while alive." Sighing, Loki took the spear out of Agnar's hands and muttered a few perfunctory words of gratitude to the man. The spear had been thrust into Loki's hand once before and he had carried it daily for 2 years while he impersonated his father, but it still didn't sit comfortably in his hand. Loki slid his palm down a few inches and clenched Gingnir's shaft. "You are right, mother, you always are," Loki said. "I have had the night to grieve and now it is morning. There is a great deal of work to be done. Lord Agnar, have you anything to write on?" When the man shook his head, Loki shrugged and dismissed him, then summoned a few sheets of paper from his father's study. These were remnants of the king's stationery, crisp, thick and Asgard's cityscape embossed at the bottom of each sheet. "Hugin. Munin," Loki muttered while he pulled a chair over to the narrow table between the room's 2 windows. A few moments later, the 2 ravens dove through the doorway with low, gurgling croaks. Munin, always the shyer of the 2, perched on the headboard of Odin's bed. Hugin, meanwhile, landed in his favorite spot to linger, atop Gingnir. "Get down, you menace, as if this thing was not heavy enough without you squatting on it." Loki tipped the spear forward until Hugin had no choice but to relocate himself onto Loki's forearm. "No claws either, please. I have a task for you, a message that cannot go astray." Both ravens cawed excitedly, but they were soon disappointed. The letter still had to be written. It took 4 aborted drafts before Loki realized that brevity would best suit his intent and contented himself with a concise, if inelegant missive. "Unto Laufey Blainson, King of Jotunheim, Your Majesty. It has been reported to me that your people have captured my brother, Thor Odinson, when he and his companions traveled to your realm. I wish to discuss what arrangements can be made between our 2 realms to secure my brother's safe return to Asgard. Please send a reply with the ravens indicating if you would be amenable to such a discussion. My regards to you and your house, Loki Odinson, Prince Regent of Asgard." Laufey's answer came swiftly. His letter was 2 lines long and missing basic courtesies, but its contents offered Loki a modicum of hope. They would have a meeting. Midday of the following day. Loki threw himself into preparations and contingency planning at once. 24 hours later, however, he felt no more ready than he had been the day before. Loki pulled closer the papers Lady Adis had laid out for him and rubbed his eyes. Adis's records were full of terse notations and sharp underlines, just what Loki would have expected of Asgard's treasurer. His father too had been satisfied with Adis's work. His notes were few and his elaborate signature featured on the bottom of each page. But no matter the hand that had written them, the numbers and the words no longer made sense to Loki. No matter how hard he tried to concentrate, the pages blurred together. "We have compensated everyone for the additional transport needed to bring the Einherjar, their equipment and stocks into the city. As you can see, the cost already incurred is not insubstantial," Adis said. "It will be more challenging to bring goods into Jotunheim and therefore more costly," Loki replied. Adis ran her tongue over her lower lip. "The throne of Asgard is yours right now, Your Highness. Only you can determine which expense is justified and which isn't." 2 tolls came from the belfry. It was 1/2 the hour. Only half an hour more until the moment of reckoning. "Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown," Loki said in a sullen tone. He began to gather up the treasury records, but Adis caught his hand and shook her head. "I will take care of these. You would be better served heading down and verifying all is in order there." "I suppose so," Loki muttered. "I doubt more figures will help me at this point." He rested his weight on Gingnir and pushed himself to his feet, feeling the weight of every hour he hadn't slept in the past week. As much as he was reluctant to leave the relative serenity of the council chamber, his treasurer had a point. He couldn't hide in here for the rest of time. However, he was all of 20 feet from the chamber's entrance when Tyr descended upon him. The man had taken the time to change into his formal uniform since Loki had seen him last, but he had not paid any attention to his hair or beard, which left him exuding an air of ominous volatility. "So it is true then? You're going through with this?" he hissed as he forced himself into Loki's path. "You're willing to negotiate with them?" Loki inched back until Tyr was no longer in his personal space. "I am. They are filth. It abysses all of Asgard to even contemplate such a thing. You know what they did to you brother and the soldiers who were with him. You saw what they did to your father, to my daughter. It is merely another chapter in millennia of misdeeds. Death is the only thing we ought to offer them. They will offer death to many an Asgardian should we pursue war. Coward, Tyr scoffed, moving towards Loki once more. You're soft? All sorcerers are. You're 1/10 a man my daughter was. It's curious how you never had one positive comment about her while she was around to hear it, Loki retorted. Tyr's already agitated expression twisted into a grotesque mask of disdain and his skin flushed an unhealthy crimson. That had been a careless thing to say. Loki realized his mistake at once. Tyr was in a poor state of mind. Loki had been too busy preparing for his meeting with Laufey to inquire about Sif's condition this morning, but things had looked worse, not better late last night. But what was he to do now? Loki was presently the master of Asgard and Tyr had insulted him to his face. It would hardly be fitting for Loki to be the first one to attempt to make amends. He waited, hoping that Tyr would offer them both a way out, but Tyr merely glared at Loki with disgust. There is more to life than honor and the glory of battle, Lord Tyr, Loki said in the end. It would do you well to remember also that I am Prince Regent at the present and I expect to be treated with the same courtesy you would offer my father or my brother. That, unfortunately, quickened Tyr once more. Obsequiousness is not my habit. I offer you the courtesy of my honest opinion, your highness, as I would offer it to any ruler of Asgard. I dare say there is a way to offer your opinion without insulting a person's manhood. Do you think Laufey's words will be mild and sweet? Tyr smirked. The old man isn't going to relent on this, is he? Loki flexed his shoulders, drew himself to his full height and forced all excess emotion out of his words. As it happens, Tyr, I'm about to find out. Now, if you intend to be present, we had best head down. If not, step out of my way. I will not be late for this meeting. To Loki's relief, Tyr still had the presence of mind to step out of Loki's way and allow him to pass. The sense of relief proved momentary, however, because Tyr then followed Loki to the lesser reception room, always trailing 3 steps behind him. He fell back only in the reception room's antechamber when Lord Agnar called him over. Loki himself hurried into the room proper. Like so many other days, the great hall would lie empty today. The purpose of that grand, echoing space was to awe and overwhelm, which often wasn't the sentiment the king of Asgard wanted to communicate while in a diplomatic wrangle. Hence the royal palace had 2 reception rooms, the greater and the lesser. It was sometimes misconstrued that a reception held in this smaller room was some half-masked insult from the king of Asgard. This was inaccurate. The moniker, lesser, referred only to the room's smaller dimensions. The decision as to which room would be used depended primarily on the size of the visiting party and the retinue the Allfather wished with him on the day. Since Laufey wouldn't be present in the flesh and Loki hardly wanted half of Asgard watching the proceedings, the lesser reception was the logical choice. Loki was somewhat surprised to find the room empty. The counselors seemed to be occupied amongst themselves. Snippets of their conversation occasionally audible through the open doors leading back to the antechamber. Otherwise, all was quiet. The servants had done their work. Someone had even had the forethought to swap out the usual tapestries depicting Odin's triumphant victories for pieces featuring less incendiary subjects, and made themselves scarce. Loki, there you are, his mother said as she entered the room and found Loki standing right in the center, checking that no important detail had been missed. She dismissed her 2 handmaids and offered Loki the lidded ceramic mug she held in her hands. I thought you wouldn't refuse this. He accepted the mug and removed the lid. He immediately smelled the nutmeg and ginger in the warm, honey-hued liquid. But there was a sharper undercurrent to it too. No amount of spices could mask the magic. Loki took a sip, which confirmed his suspicions. I am aghast, mother, he said, shaking his head in mock disapproval. How many times have you warned me about the dangers of such concoctions? You look to be in need of it, his mother replied. Loki took a large gulp and waited until the tingling sensation in his mouth subsided. I expect I do. I haven't so much as got a glimpse of my bed for 2 nights now. He took a deep breath. The potion wasn't as strong as Loki would have mixed it had he prepared it, but it certainly left him feeling more like himself. Thank you, I can already feel it working. How is father today? The same. In Sif, Frigga's lips drew together. You haven't been told? That, I'm sorry, child. She passed away this morning. Oh, Loki muttered. That explains Tyr's temper earlier. I shall have to give my condolences to Sif's family once this is over. No one will think it a slight to not hear from you at once. You have taken on the duties of the king. Everyone understands how busy you are right now." Loki nodded absently and turned towards the bra dominated the back half of the room. There wasn't much time left. He drank the remainder of the potion and replaced the lid. His heart pulsed, but he couldn't be sure if it was the potion's effects or his nerves getting the better of him. "I should take my place," he said softly. Just as he shifted away from his mother, she rested her hand on his bicep, then pulled the empty mug out of his grasp. "Loki, although your father seems far from us, it is not so. He still sees all, and I know he is proud of you today, as am I." His lips and tongue couldn't quite form the words he was looking for, so he simply nodded. His mother smiled and withdrew to one of the chairs set up either side of the throne. And all too soon, the bell tolled out the hour, midday. Everyone who was still standing hurried to their seats. Once everyone was in position, Loki sucked in a breath and focused his attention on the Eye of Angerboda. It wasn't much to look at. A hollow ring, about 2 of Loki's hand spans in diameter, that rested atop a stout alabaster pillar. He sent a spark of magic into the rain, silently thanking his mother for the potion once more. He hadn't considered the strain this exercise would put on his magic. That was if the meeting would be going ahead. The Eye of Angerboda was merely an unattractive piece of palace furnishing until its counterpart, which Loki had sent over to Jotunheim the previous evening, also stirred to life. Seconds stretched out into minutes. Everyone gathered grew restless, exchanging meaningful glances as if Loki lacked the peripheral vision to notice their behavior. He was about to summon the ravens and send them off to Utgard, when the eye spun. It hummed as it whirled around. Its rotation sped up until it looked like a solid sphere. Then it snapped open and projected an image across the entire back half of the reception room. Loki sat upon his stone throne, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. He had only one person at his side. A female frost giant about an inch shorter than Loki. No doubt Loki needed someone to work the Eye of Angerboda for him. Loki had never heard of a Jotnar king skilled in magic. "You have begged me for an audience, Prince Regent," Loki said. "I would have thought you would have something to say, yet here you are looking like a doe who has wandered in the hunter's path." It stung how accurate the assessment was. As haggard and bent as Loki was, seated amid shadows and unpolished stone, Loki was nothing less than a master of his kingdom. Loki, on the other hand, squirmed upon a throne intended for a man twice his size. Worse yet, he was surrounded by a gaggle of advisors. The 7 of them and his mother were all ready to jump in should anything go amiss. "What was I thinking to have them all here? I work better alone." "Greetings, King Loki," Loki said as evenly as he could manage. "I thank you for acquiescing to this meeting. Relations between our 2 realms have taken an unfortunate turn in recent days. I believe it is in our mutual interest if we do not allow the situation to escalate further. Why are you the regent? Is Odin too decrepit now to be lifted out of bed and sat upon that gilded eyesore? I believe this is solid gold, not gilded. As to my father, he rests in Odin sleep. A pity. I would have welcomed his face heavy with knowledge that his son is in my hands to do with as it pleases me." Loki wrapped his left hand around the decorative armrest of the throne and reminded himself that Loki wouldn't miss any opportunity to bait him. "I want proof my brother remains in your custody and that he has not been mistreated." "I have him. Don't fret, pup." Loki straightened his back and rose, confirming for Loki once and for all that his birth father was as tall as the frost giants were reputed to be. He moved slowly, his steps uneven. The projection from the eye tracked him, but the effect was somewhat disorientating. It took Loki a moment to realize that Loki had merely crossed to the back half of the hall. And there was no doubt Loki still had Thor. 2 chains, suspended from the ceiling, held Thor's arms above his head. Another 2 snaked across the ice-covered flagstones and met at an unsightly metal contraption that girt Thor's torso. The need for the chains was questionable, however. Thor was slumped down on his knees and his head hung limp. His hair obscured his face so Loki couldn't tell if Thor was conscious. Loki glanced to his mother. Her face was ashen and she had pressed her hands over her mother, but she had the presence of mind to keep quiet. Agnar and Tyr, on the other hand, were muttering among themselves. Loki lifted Gungnir an inch into the air and sharply brought it down, startling them into silence. "I cannot tell if he lives. In fact, I cannot be certain this is my brother, not some facsimile." I wish to speak to Thor before we go on, Loki said. No, Loki grabbed a fistful of Thor's hair and pulled Thor's hair up until Loki could peer into the incandescent crimson swirling within his brother's eyes. He sleeps. I would not want to disturb his sweet dreams. Of course, if you insist on definitive proof, I would be happy to slide my knife into his throat and verify that he still bleeds. Loki forced a smile. You do that and I'll be forced to do some very unfortunate things in return. I wonder if you'd have the stomach. I had stomach enough to murder you once. Right now I wouldn't be upset to do so a second time. If we can get to the heart of the matter, Loki said, I am willing to make concessions in exchange for my brother's safe return to Asgard and to ensure that the past is consigned to history. Tit-for-tat attacks will only bring more grief upon our peoples. Loki released his grip on Thor and headed back to the comfort of his throne. Tit-for-tat? Your newly crowned king and 24 warriors walked into Jotunheim without warning. What transgression did Jotunheim commit to warrant this? You have killed or injured nearly all the warriors that accompanied him. Moreover, you have captured our king. Has Asgard not paid for its folly? Your brother has. Asgard? Not so much. This was a military incursion into our lands. A violation of the peace treaty signed between us. Prince Helblindi brought his warriors into the heart of Asgard first. You violated the treaty, not Asgard, Lord Agnar said. Helblindi violated the peace and he paid for it with his life. For the first time in Loki's memory, Loki's words lacked a derisive undertone. I accept the punishment the Norns have apportioned to the prince for his hubris. I neither knew of his plan nor would have condoned it should he have shared it with me. He was your son. How could you be wholly ignorant? Loki asked. Does Odin know all that you entangle yourself in? Loki had to concede the point. He could imagine Helblindi as a young prince eager to prove his worth to his people and to his father, who would rush into an ill-conceived adventure to reclaim the great prize of Jotunheim. Thor wouldn't have hesitated if such an opportunity presented to him. At the same time, Loki could well have lied. It afforded him no advantage to admit he had a hand in his son's gamble and Helblindi wasn't around to tell anyone otherwise. Whatever the truth, Loki saw no victory in calling Loki out on this. It seems both parties have cause to be aggrieved, he said instead, but there is no sense in counting punches placed and blows received for the rest of our lives. As long as I have your word we can put this behind us, I will be content. I will authorize to return to Jotunheim the bodies of the slain in Bagi, the frost giant captured after Prince Helblindi's incursion into Asgard. I am also willing to offer substantial economic. I cannot return the Asgardian dead, we burned them. Only ashes and armor remain, you are welcome to that. Your brother too, as long as you return the casket of ancient winters. Here it is. He is as predictable as the tides. That. Loki waited until his advisors finished thing, then went on. That is out of the question. The casket rightfully belongs to Jotunheim. If you possess the casket, what is to stop you from invading Midgard or another planet? No, you cannot be trusted with it. Loki leaned back and furrowed his brows as if to feign confusion. Yet you want me to release your brother on your word, and your word alone, that the conflict between us has ended. He is the king of Asgard. Once he returns, he will sit upon the throne, not you. What is to stop him from ignoring all you have promised and launching an attack on my people once more? If that is what he chooses to do, I will personally beat him until he comes to his senses, Loki replied. But the point is moot. The casket is not yours any longer. It was taken as wargild for the Asgardian and Midgardian lives the Jotnar took in the last war. I will pay for my brother's release in gold, in silver, in Asgardian goods, in favorable trade deals and in master craftsmen to work on projects in Jotunheim. I will not hand over the casket to you. Around him, his advisors sat up straighter. This was their moment. Loki didn't possess the in-depth knowledge of Asgardian resources and economic situation that his father commanded after centuries on the throne. He needed to rely on expert knowledge if he were to negotiate a fair deal for both Asgard and Jotunheim. Loki's lips curled with distaste. I have no need to wrap myself in gold or dress myself in silks, nor do my people. I do not care about trade deals and I do not want any of your craftsmen. We have skilled laborers enough. We are not the primitive savages you claim us to be. I will have the casket. Loki sighed. Anyone would have anticipated the frost giants would demand the casket in exchange for Thor's return. But only a fool would believe that Asgard would ever hand the casket back into Laufey's hands, and Loki had never noted any signs that Laufey was a fool. He would demand and try to cow Loki into submission. At the end of the day, Laufey would accept that Thor's ransom would be paid with lesser treasures and trinkets. "How can I make this clearer for you? The casket will not be a part of these negotiations," Loki said. "Patience is the quickest path to victory here. If that is so, I do at least appreciate the symmetry to this affair. Odin took my son, I now took his son in return. You said yourself, Helblindy's end was the result of his own actions. I do not speak of Helblindy." Taking advantage of Loki's confusion, Laufey pressed on, his words becoming progressively more animated. "There was a child born at the close of the war. Well loved and regretfully, left unattended. The Allfather stumbled upon it. I wonder if he took the time to search for the child's parents before he claimed it for Asgard. You remember, Lord Tyr. You remember, don't you? A blue-skinned infant wrapped in a blood-red cloak." Loki clenched the Gingnir, his knuckles turning white. He glanced to Tyr, but he couldn't make out the man's thoughts from Tyr's expression. Loki didn't dare to look to his mother. One glance in her direction would betray far too much. "I don't know what you're talking about." Loki shook his head, trying his best not to keep his panic out of his voice. "Do you want? Or maybe the skin wasn't blue by then. Magic can do wondrous things. Still, it cannot strip away all. Blood remains true. After all, someone had to show Helblindy the path into Asgard." "What? Have you any proof of this?" Loki didn't even care that his words were drowned amid the uproar from the rest of the people in the reception room. His insides were twisting onto themselves, and he was sure there wasn't a drop of blood left in his face. "You have many counselors, Prince Regent. Why don't you send them to find what the truth is?" Laufey grinned. "It seems we are at an impasse here, and I am done talking. If Asgardians want their king back, they need only to come to Jotunheim and lay the casket at my feet." The projection blinked out. For all the noise in the room only seconds before, silence now reigned. "This is fucking perfect." Loki rubbed his face. "Nothing but lies and mockery. This is what you get for trying to reason with a frost giant." "Fine," he let out an irritated snarl. "Fine, so be it. We march on Jotunheim." Loki pulled off his jacket and let the heavy garment sink to the floor. His leather vest soon also lay crumpled on the ground, leaving him in a silk shirt. The thin material rippled over his skin as a gust of cool air swept through the room. Loki reached for the window. There was an unpleasant chill to the wind this evening. The lanterns down on the foreshore gave him pause. He hadn't expected anyone would still be out there. He had come down for the funeral ceremony, of course. The ruler of Asgard could hardly forego attendance, and Loki thought that Thor would appreciate him being present since Thor himself could not be there. But for all the effort Sif's older sisters had expended in organizing it, there had been an odd atmosphere to the event. Tyr barely met anyone's eye. The rest of the Einherjar's leadership surreptitiously attempted to coordinate troop movements throughout the ceremony, and half the gathered crowd seemed more interested in gawking at Loki than in paying respects to the dead. He had fled back to the palace minutes after Sif's funeral boat passed out of sight. Someone knocked on the door. Loki shut the window and called out, "Come in." An aide-de-camp from Tyr's staff stepped into the room. With his hair slicked back and each tassel of his uniform in its proper place, he looked like the Einherjar was due out on parade tonight. His bow matched the immaculate state of his dress. His face, however, betrayed the depth of the man's nervousness. "Something on your mind, Captain?" Loki asked. "Only the challenge that faces us tomorrow, Your Highness," the man responded and made an effort to steal his expression. He thrust out a letter towards Loki. "I have an update on the progress of the advance parties for you." "Thank you." The man's hand snapped back as Loki took the letter from him and he hurried out. Loki watched the door slowly swing shut behind him, wondering if he ought to have ordered Sif's funeral to be delayed. It was Asgardian custom to farewell the dead at the first sunset after their passing, but Sif's funeral boat of flame would have done nothing for the soldiers' morale. However much her personality had grated on Loki, she had been respected as a warrior. Her father too. And she had died by the hand of the very enemy the soldiers would be fighting come the morning. Loki had thought Tyr would use his eulogy to rouse the Einherjar. For once his bluster and antipathy towards the frost giants would have been of some benefit. As it turned out, Tyr had been in the wrong frame of mind. His speech had been apologetic in tone, full of stumbles and at times impossible to follow. Loki himself wasn't helping matters, he understood that. He lacked both Odin's experience and Thor's natural bravado. Worse yet, it was public knowledge he had been against the war with Jotunheim until the very last moment. Hardly an inspiring leader to rally around. He could only hope his council followed his orders and kept quiet about what had been said during the meeting with Loki. There were rumors he couldn't afford to have flying about the palace right now. "I'll have to find some words to say tomorrow," he muttered under his breath. "Something that'll get the drums of war going, otherwise Thor'll be Loki's guest for a long time." Sighing, Loki broke the seal on the letter and trudged to his bedroom. He took off the 2 scabbards that held his knives, setting them on the bedside table, then collapsed onto the bed. When he unfolded the stiff paper, he found an equally stiff report inside describing the evening's efforts with the portals. Asgardian sorcerers had spent days tracking down the narrowing gaps between the worlds and identifying where Asgard's vulnerabilities lay. But these portals functioned in both directions. By the time the main Asgardian force entered Jotunheim tomorrow, there would be dozens of advance parties already creeping towards Loki's capital. After a few lines riddled with Einherjar jargon and shorthand that Loki had to strain to decipher, he pulled a pillow under his head and closed his eyes. His mother's potion had worn off hours ago. He needed a few minutes to himself right now. After, he would get back to the report and parse out the rest of its contents. Something pressed against his Adam's apple. Loki groaned and reached to pull the offending object away. A hand clamped around his wrist. Loki's eyes snapped open. There were several people in his bedroom. That was all he managed to register before he was pulled out of bed and dumped onto the floor. Disorientated, he was still clambering up to his knees as hands slid under his armpits and pulled him to his feet. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Once he blinked away the bleariness out of his eyes, the world around him found focus. There were 6 people in the room, apart from himself. Agnar, Tyr and 4 high-ranking Einherjar soldiers. Loki snuck a glance to the bedside table. His knives weren't where he had left them. "Lord Chancellor, care to explain?" Agnar's reply was a bewildered stare. His mouth dangled as low as his overly ornate collar would allow. Tyr nudged the Chancellor. "You believe me now? By all that you hold dear," Loki said, "you had best have a very good reason." Lord Agnar wanted proof. Proof of what? Loki turned to face Tyr and felt something rigid against his throat once more. He reached for it, then froze. The back of his hand was blue. "Fucking hell. What have you done to me?" Loki tried to restore the concealment, but his magic had been stripped. He grabbed the object wrapped around his neck, a wide collar, metal and etched with some kind of inscriptions. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't rip it off. "Right. Okay. You'd better give the performance of your life here." "What is this collar? Get it off me," Loki said in a shaky voice. He pulled up the sleeve of his shirt and upon finding only more blue skin, palpated his face. "What have you done to me? Why?" Agnar shifted from one foot to the other. "The collar is dwarven work, Your Highness, one of several items in the vault that can be used to bind a person's magic. We needed to see if there were any concealments on you. It seems there were, and not minor ones. And my, what a tragedy to have you hidden all these years." Tyr chuckled. "Your eyes are striking. Nifmar. There's bound to be a mirror somewhere in here. Fetch it for our resident frost giant, will you?" "Frost giant?" Tyr moved aside as Nifmar dragged over the full-length mirror from Loki's bathroom. He angled it so Loki could peer right into his reflection. Blue skin, clan markings, red eyes. Loki didn't have to force the shiver that rattled through his body. "This isn't real." He clawed at the collar and tried to figure out the lock mechanism keeping it in place until 2 of the soldiers moved in to restrain him. Tyr shook his head. "Enough with the melodrama. Let's not pretend you thought Loki was talking about anyone other than yourself. How many frost giants are there in Asgard?" Loki was angry. He was making things up. Loki sucked in a breath and furrowed his brows. "He wasn't he?" "I think the answer is self-evident," Tyr replied. "Take the prince down to the Great Hall. We will continue the conversation there." The Einherjar prodded him forward. As they moved through the half-lit and near-empty hallways, Loki considered calling out to the palace guards, but he suspected in his present form he would have problems proving he was who he claimed to be. Tyr, on the other hand, was their commander. They would do whatever Tyr ordered. Loki's thoughts turned to Agnar. The Chancellor was the king's second in command and wielded more authority than the captain of the Einherjar. Asgard wasn't a military dictatorship after all. Apart from the man's initial incredulity, Loki wasn't sure what Angar's thoughts were about the present situation. Perhaps if he were to make the man remember that he was more than a frost giant, Loki could yet make an ally of him. So Laufey was telling the truth. I was taken after the war. Loki LD my father do that? Why not tell me the truth at least? Lord Tyr, Lord Agnar, please explain how this is possible. War does strange things to men. Tyr threw open the side doors to the Great Hall. I told Odin back then that you were not worth the cloak he wrapped you in, but he refused to listen. The bulk of the lamps in the Great Hall were extinguished. It was hard to even make out the walls, leaving Loki with a sense he was in some cavernous pit. The sole island of light was the dais. The throne was unoccupied, but the rest of the king's council stood on the steps below it. As Loki's small party approached the dais, more Einherjari soldiers emerged from the darkness. There were dozens in all. Far more than necessary if they were worried about Loki. His magic was bound and he had no idea where his knives had ended up. Something tells me the collar won't be coming off just yet. Loki made a show of attempting to smile. Was there a party invitation I missed? For all the outward differences, Loki still sounded the same. A palace guard was unlikely to be familiar enough with Loki's voice to recognize it when it emanated from a frost giant's mouth. The king's advisors were a different matter. They had all been at Odin's side for centuries, if not millennia. They had practically watched Loki grow up. And they all looked distinctly uncomfortable once they heard him speak. Agnar, perhaps because he'd had some minutes already to accustom himself to Loki's true features, recovered first. He grimaced and slowly climbed the steps up, then turned to face the dark vastness of the hall. I thank you all for coming despite the peculiar hour. It is a matter that cannot wait the light of day. Lord Tyr has made an accusation of treason against the Prince Regent. We must determine whether there is merit in the commander's claims and whether the prince should remain regent. Loki ran his hand through his hair, grimacing at the way the ridges on his knuckles caught the strands. It seems the former king and queen kept certain basic facts from me, he said, making sure his voice trembled a little as he spoke. But it is not treason to be born a frost giant, surely. What am I being accused of? I believe the Prince Regent has been conspiring with the frost giants to weaken Asgard and to secure the throne for himself, Tyr replied. Loki spun around to face Tyr. What? Why is it that when the king of Jotunheim asserts there is treason among us, Asgardians, the Prince Regent all but laughs off the words? Tyr said. He hadn't joined the rest of the councillors up on the dais and now made a slow circuit along the broad semicircle his Einherjar had formed across the floor of the Great Hall. It's because he already knows the traitor's identity. Unprecedented events have befallen Asgard recently. Who was involved in them all? Who benefited from them? Prince Loki. It seems strange to me that for all his skill in the magic arts, he was unable to close a portal in time to prevent the frost giants escaping after their assault on the vault. Stranger yet that he would miss time dropping his protective shield in Jotunheim when Odin's life was at stake. But it's not so strange when you realize this was the intent. I suspect the plan was for Odin to die in Jotunheim, but the Odin sleep saved him. Do not attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence, Loki responded. Spellwork is finicky. All the more when time is not on the sorcerer's side. I dare say you too have made mistakes in the chaos of battle. I've never made a mistake that directly led me to be proclaimed ruler of Asgard. Loki glanced up to the vacant throne. I have no desire to rule Asgard. What have I gained from my mistakes? Lord Tyr, my father is gravely ill, my brother is captured and Asgard is at war. Odin is not your father and Thor is not your brother, and I doubt you care about Asgard at all. Then why have I spent so much energy trying to keep the realm out of this war? Who knows, maybe Laufey needed time to gather his forces. Unsupported assumptions have no place in this conversation, Ada said. Loki pursed his lips. She might be presenting herself as a moderating voice now, but she had to have known of Agnar and Tyr's plans. Everything in the weapons vault had been transferred into the treasury. They would have needed her authorization to enter the treasury vaults and take the collar currently rubbing a blister into Loki's neck. He wondered if any of them had entertained a thought that they could ask Loki to voluntarily put on the collar before they decided on the clandestine ambush in his bedroom. It seemed unlikely, and that unnerved Loki all the more. "The point doesn't change," Tyr responded. "The entire time he has been the most pro-Jotnar voice in the palace. We have always thrown the dead giants into pits and buried them, but he would have them accorded the same honors as Asgardian fallen. It verges on blasphemy." He demanded also the frost giant his King Thor captured should be given unprecedented comforts. In fact, on the very night the king sought the prince, intent on having him accompany the king's party to Jotunheim, the prince was nowhere to be found. Convenient if one wanted to avoid the ambush that met the king in Jotunheim. And where was the prince that night? Busy being bosom buddies with the frost giant in our dungeons. And is it not curious how quick the prince was to explain how the portal was made? It's quite clear now. He knew how the portal was made because he led the frost giants to it. Loki tried to keep his face neutral. Out of all the stupidity Tyr had just rattled off, the portal was Loki's sole true transgression. He was fairly sure, however, Tyr had no way of proving this. The frost giants involved with Loki's original plans were either dead or in Jotunheim. Bajie clearly didn't know of Loki's involvement, or he would have said something long before now. "You are repeating the words of the king of Jotunheim, who is our enemy," Loki said. "It is in his interest to sow discord among us when we are on the eve of war with Jotunheim." Now it seems he had hit upon a certain truth, but it does not make the rest of his words true. It is a common liar's trick. Mix in a bit of truth into your lie and it'll sound more convincing. Still, at the end of the day, a lie remains a lie. My loyalty is with Asgard and will be always. Tyr began to respond, but Adis spoke over him. How did Laufey know Loki was one of his? Or has he always known? Why then not claim the child earlier? Because until now he had no reason to, Tyr replied. Laufey does not move a finger unless it benefits him in some way. No, that's not it. He was waiting until the child grew up and he could make use of him. The plan worked out, has it not? Look at the state of Asgard right now. Loki dropped his head, but found the collar cut into the edge of his jawline. He nudged his chin up. I think I might know what happened, he said. It seemed a good idea to volunteer information where he could. Appearing cooperative could only help him. During the fight down in the vault, one of the frost giants grabbed my arm. She did something and my limb went cold, then the skin turned blue. It looked like my hands do now. I thought it was some obscure Jotun magic, and with everything else going on, I didn't dwell on it. Thinking about it now though, the frost giant looked more startled by the result than I was. She must have realized she pushed through the concealment magic. I've seen the dead and she wasn't among them, so she could have told Laufey about me. From there, he would have extrapolated the truth. There could only be so many children unaccounted for that match my description. A plausible theory, Agnar said. On the other hand, it relies on your word and yours alone. You did not share this story with anyone else until now, I take it? No, but I'm not obligated to share with the council every detail of my life. Watch your tone, boy, one of the other councillors muttered. Agnar waved his hand dismissively. For the sake of is there any truth to the accusation that you were involved in bringing the frost giants into Asgard? No, Loki replied flatly. How did you know that the portal was tied to the convergence? Loki's shoulders sunk. They wouldn't believe him if he claimed it was a fortunate guess. I have been experimenting with portals myself, he said. I thought it was likely that if I noticed the effect the convergence was having on the boundaries between the realms, others could have too. Did you make any trips to Jotunheim during these experiments? No, Agnar clasped his hands together. Where to then? Svartalheim and Vanaheim. Before you ask, that is where the portals I found led to. I never thought to look for possible portals in the antechamber to the weapons vault, Loki answered. And what if we are to say that we found your magical signature on the other side of the portal that the frost giants came through? Tyr asked. I'd say, so what? People and goods travel through portals, so does magic. I did a spell to close it. I was around for the initial exploration of the portal. How many times has that portal been meddled with since then? I would have been very surprised if you didn't find traces of my magic on both ends of the portal by now. Thank the Norns you cannot date a magical signature or this'll be the end of me." Loki's words stirred some uncertainty among the councillors. Agnar turned to the Minister for Public Works, who stood to his left and hissed something in his ear. Others soon butted in on the conversation. Usually, Loki and Frigga were the designated consultants on all matters magical. Of course, on this occasion Loki was no help to them and Frigga too was unlikely to aid them. The Minister for Public Works had a familiarity with magic, but judging from his body language, properties of magic flows through portals were beyond his limited expertise. Loki cleared his throat. "Are there any other accusations being thrown at me, councillors?" "Other accusations?" Tyr retorted. "You have not disproved anything presented so far. Nor have you provided any definitive proof on any statement you made, Lord Tyr. I have the outermost respect for you and I have given you the time to make your voice heard, but all of this is just conjecture and fantasy. I'm not a traitor and I've no desire to usurp Thor's place. I have made errors, yes, and my mistakes have proven to be costly. I would now like to focus on setting them right, not on this theater." "There is one more thing I wish to address," Agnar said. "The king of Jotunheim stated there was a traitor in Asgard. You ignored him and told us not to speak of it. Why?" "Because he had no reason to tell the truth and every reason to lie." "Was the possibility not worth investigating?" Loki shook his head in feigned disbelief. "Perhaps, yes. I've already said that I'm not infallible. Perhaps this was one more error on my part. But, Lord Agnar, you're my advisor right now. If you believed I was acting imprudently, why didn't you do your job and advise me to take a better course of action?" "I tried, Your Highness. You are not listening to me." Thinking back to the minutes after Loki ended the negotiations, Loki found he couldn't be sure of Agnar's words one way or the other. He remembered a flurry of overlapping conversation. He remembered too trying to ignore them all as he attempted to swallow his worry over Thor's safety and his panic about the accusations Loki had thrown at him. A competent advisor knows how to pick the appropriate moment to approach his sovereign with suggestions, Loki said. "You picked the wrong one." Agnar offered him a mirthless smile. "Noted, Your Highness." "Well, are you all satisfied?" Loki asked, "Councillors?" While Agnar seemed to make a survey of his peers, Tyr finally climbed up the steps and took up his position to the left of the Chancellor. Agnar squared his shoulders. "When it comes to claims of treason, I believe definitive evidence is scant, but there is still the matter of the Regency. King Thor did not leave detailed guidance on who should take up Gungnir in his absence. With the former king also indisposed, this council voted to give the Regency to Prince Loki. However, the council retained the right to strip the prince of his regency should there be need. I believe the time has come for a vote. Does you have no evidence of any wrongdoing on my part?" Loki took a step back, so he could see the whole council at once. "All you have are rambling accusations from Lord Tyr and the words of Asgard's enemy. I explained to you already why Loki cannot be trusted. And, respectfully, what is Lord Tyr's state of mind right now? He buried his daughter today. He is grieving and angry and looking for someone to blame?" "You've said enough, Loki," Agnar replied. "Councillors, your votes." Tyr's words rang out first, of course. They were quickly followed by 4 more. All called for Loki's removal. Loki grit his teeth as the rest of the council gave their votes. By the time all the councillors had spoken, only 2 votes had gone in Loki's favor and they were useless to him. The vote didn't have to be unanimous, a simple majority would suffice. "Damn you all." Agnar clasped his hands together. "Then it is done. Prince Loki, you are stripped of the Regency. How the hell are you planning to explain this to the rest of Asgard?" Loki laughed bitterly. "What am I guilty of? Being a frost giant? We cannot prove treason at this time, but overall your conduct has been questionable and with Asgard's delicate present political situation, you are not the appropriate person to occupy the throne of Asgard." Loki drew in a long breath and pressed his teeth together. He wasn't surprised at this outcome, not really. This night hadn't been heading anywhere good from the moment Tyr's men had pulled him out of bed. Still, that didn't mean he wasn't furious. "It may be soon or it may be centuries, but don't be mistaken about this. A day will come when each one of you will regret your choices today," he said. Tyr scoffed, then whispered into Agnar's ear. Once he received a nod from the Chancellor, Tyr gestured towards his soldiers. There is no reason for him to be present any longer. Einherjar, take the frost giant to his quarters. 2 men grabbed Loki from behind and 8 more formed a tight perimeter around him. They manhandled him out of the great hall and out in the shadowed corridors of the palace. Loki preoccupied himself with making their task as difficult as possible. It took him far longer than it should have to notice that the soldiers were not leading him back up to his rooms. "Where are we going?" Loki asked. When he received no answer, he pressed the matter. "Where are we headed? Answer me." The soldier leading Loki's makeshift guard chuckled. "Your new quarters, your highness. Somewhere a frost giant would feel more at home." Loki scraped his thumbnail across the brow of a soldier attempting to hold onto him and pressed his thumb into the man's eyeball. Einherjar armor was well designed, there were few vulnerabilities for Loki to exploit. And Loki was half-dressed and unarmed as the 6 of them manhandled him. He had no qualms about exploiting every dirty move in his repertoire. To Loki's glee, the soldier howled with pain. Loki hooked his foot around the back of the man's knees, but before Loki could flip him onto the ground, the 2 soldiers from the back of Loki's guard grabbed onto him. One of them aimed a solid punch into Loki's back. Loki responded by dislocating the man's forefinger. For all his efforts, he couldn't avoid his fate. The party moved, slowly and inexorably, towards its final destination, the old, half-abandoned corridor at the base of the palace. More soldiers were stationed there, shifting impatiently from foot to foot before an unlocked cell door. "What are you waiting for?" shouted the soldier who commanded Loki's guard. They flung open the cell door and scurried to the side. A moment later Loki himself was flung through the opening and into the cell. By the time Loki jumped back onto his feet, however, the lock was firmly on the door. "Enjoy the rest of your night, your highness." The commander grinned and motioned for his men to leave. Loki straightened himself as much as he could, tucking in his shirt and smoothing his hair. There was no point in throwing himself at the cell's thick metal bars as if he were a rabid beast. No amount of effort would shift them. Besides, 3 Einherjar soldiers remained behind and were presently staring at him. The first step to a successful escape was to wait until your guards were occupied elsewhere before you attempted it. "Who might you be?" Baji asked. Loki turned and laughed. Of course Tyr had put him in the cell right next to Baji's. The frost giant came up to the bars that separated their cells and rested his head against one of the bars. "You know me, Baji," Loki replied in a dry tone. "Your voice is familiar." Baji frowned and it was a long moment until he spoke again. "You sound like the Prince of Asgard." "I do, don't I?" Loki had the beginnings of half a dozen self-depreciating jokes at the tip of his tongue, but he wasn't in the mood for any of them, so he simply shrugged. While Baji threw one questions at him after another, Loki wiped away the blood pooling on his lip, palpated his aching ribs and glanced at what he had to work with. His cell was better furnished than Baji's. The dining table, the leather chairs, the wide daybed looked no different to the pieces you could find in the guest quarters for visiting dignitaries. Prisoners of noble birth were allotted some comforts in their captivity. Loki sunk onto the bed and rested his feet on the armrest. He supposed he ought to have been grateful for this concession. He had been held in more dismal prisons and remembered those miserable days clearly, but the setup here reminded him too starkly of the cell his father had thrown him into after his attempted conquest of Midgard. Eventually, Baji realized he would get no answers and left Loki alone to his thoughts. He tried to focus on solutions or at least on listening in on his guards in hope of gleaning any shred of additional information. But the soldiers outside had little to say to each other and instead of searching for a way forward, his mind turned constantly to past. Again and again, he mulled over everything he could have and should have said before the council. Minutes stretched to hours and Loki was on the verge of drifting off when commotion out in the corridor jerked him back to full alert. When he propped himself up on his elbows, he found his mother staring at him, her eyes wide. She started to say something, then shook her head. Loki bit into the inside of his cheek and waited for Frigga to take in the sum of his true features. As far as he knew, she wouldn't have seen him like this since he was little more than a newborn. It took some adjusting to. After a long, awkward moment, he sat himself up fully and broke the silence. "You should have told me." Einherjar soldiers lingered behind Frigga. Loki expected they were to report everything they heard. It would be foolish to stray from the story he had committed to earlier. I'm sorry, Loki, Frigga said. Your father thought it better you didn't know. But you disagreed, yes? You should have taken matters into your own hands. You're his wife, not his thrall. Frigga turned to the soldiers. Unlock the cell for me and retreat to the end of the hall. I wish to speak to my son alone. Our orders. Let me into the cell, good man. I absolve you of any responsibility should something befall me in there. Whatever the political situation in Asgard, Frigga still carried enough authority to send even the Einherjar into a flurry. The sergeant quickly produced the keys and opened the cell door for her. Lock it. She pointed to the lock once she was inside the cell. I'll call out when I need you. She waited until the soldiers had fallen back and out of sight before she all but ran over to Loki. You are right. I should have stood up to your father, she said. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached out and lifted up his chin. What have they done to you? Your lip is bleeding. Loki slid his hand across his lips. It's only a split lip, it must have just reopened. You can speak freely, Frigga said. I left a light ward in the hallway. Even if they hear us conversing, they won't be able to make out the words unless we shout at the top of our lungs. I'm fine. I gave as good as I got. Loki, leave it, mother, please, he cut in. And let's discuss how I came to be your son later too, hopefully when I am not in a cell. What's happening out there? I take it they weren't daft enough to appoint you regent. With all the misfortune that has recently befallen my family, they say they did me a kindness in not heaping the stress of governing upon me as well. Frigga scoffed, then ducked her head so Loki couldn't see her face, but when she spoke again, her simmering fury was obvious. There will be no regent. The council has decided to vote on all decisions among themselves. Loki, had I known. They decided to stage their coup in the middle of the night precisely so you wouldn't know until it was too late. Don't blame yourself on that account. But now that we are where we are, it's hard to argue against the council's decision. They governed often enough when father fell into Odin's sleep before and Thor left no instructions to the contrary. Agnar and Tyr will dominate the council. I know, Loki replied. Are there any signs of father waking? No, Loki glanced to Baji's unmoving form in the other cell. Frigga's warding probably didn't extend to him and there was no telling if the frost giants slept or only pretended to. Still, Loki had to ask. In Jotunheim? Too early to say I think, but there are rumors of heavy casualties. Loki pondered if Tyr and Asgard would consider it treason if they were to find out that at this moment Loki wished the complete failure of the Asgardian campaign in Jotunheim. As unkingly as it was, the resulting loss of Asgardian lives had become a tertiary consideration. The simple fact was that as long as Loki believed Thor could be the key to negotiating an agreement between Asgard and Jotunheim, he had an interest in keeping Thor alive. But if the battle plans worked out in Asgard's favor and Loki faced an Einherjar army ransacking his capital, he might well kill Thor out of spite. Still, it could be worse. Half the universe could be dead. Loki, Frigga said, her voice barely above a whisper, would you be honest with me? Is there any truth at all to what Tyr has said? All the grand gambles of war and politics fell away and the spans of centuries withered into nothing at that question. Loki was a child again, peering at his mother's soft eyes. She had always had the power to coax the truth out of him when no oankly, sometimes Loki too tired of the lies he cloaked himself in. I showed the frost giants how to enter Asgard, he replied. He would have been content to finish the confession there, but Frigga remained silent, waiting for him to go on until the full truth was exposed. Another familiar trick. Loki sighed. I was certain Thor wasn't ready to be king, so I planned to let in a few frost giants into the palace and disrupt the coronation. At the last moment, I changed my mind and decided I should trust father's judgment on this. I thought all was well, but once the frost giants knew where the portal was, they only had to find another sorcerer to open it for them. He clasped his hand together and pressed his fingers down until his knuckles ached. His mother was usually quick to reward his candor with a hug or some similar sign of affection even as she metered out his punishment. Yet she now sat unmoved, her lips drawn into a thin line. Is that all? She asked. Yes, I don't think so. You haven't been yourself, even before the frost giant attack. Loki raised an eyebrow and stifled a wince as pain throbbed through the right side of his face. What do you mean? I have been trying to put my finger on it for days, Frigga replied. You're quieter for one. I had expected to find you in a furore, But, Loki, I don't know, there were times when you gave us all such weary, melancholic looks. I wondered if you had done something terrible. Of course she noticed. I could never keep up a lie around her for long. Such as treason? He asked with a grimace. No, not that. Loki hoped she would elaborate, but his mother instead cocked her head, clearly anticipating his reply. Do you remember how I had a bad reaction to a spell on the morning of Thor's coronation? He said. When Frigga nodded, he pulled himself upright and paced the width of the cell. My magic wasn't right after that spell, it was only starting to recover in the last couple of days. It's not a pleasant thing for a sorcerer to endure. Thor's coronation weighed on me too, and then the frost giants. Well, I'm not surprised I've come across oddly. What spell was it? You never did explain. Loki froze mid-step and turned to face his mother. The temptation to confess was overwhelming. He held his breath, the first words of the truth on the tip of his tongue, but his chest ached with anxiety. True, back the first time around, she had never turned away from him, even after Midgard. But she had died not knowing half the things he had done. He had never admitted before today his part in the frost giant incursion during Thor's coronation. Worse yet, were the things he had done after her death. If he were to tell her the truth, he would have to explain how he had faked his death, subdued his father and impersonated him for 2 years. He would also have to explain his part in Thanos' madness. Even a mother's love had limits, surely. Besides, this was a different timeline, a timeline Loki had already muddled. It was possible that everything that had happened since he had played with the past had changed Frigga's attitude to the world, including to Loki himself. No, he didn't dare to take the risk. Loki let out a strangled chuckle. There are some spells a man doesn't feel comfortable discussing with his mother. Is that so? Frigga's incredulity was palpable. Just don't, he responded. He had to wonder if frost giants were capable of blushing, because his cheeks burned. On the other hand, he supposed his discomfort at this awkward lie worked in his favor. His mother would take it as proof of his embarrassment about dabbling in these sorts of questionable spell work. It was a foolish whim and I won't be trying it again. Loud rapping against the cell bars startled both Frigga and Loki. The sergeant had tired of waiting for Frigga. Her ward on the hallway worked in both directions. They couldn't make out his words, but his demeanor and tone conveyed enough. I can break you out of here, Frigga muttered. What then? Loki asked as he pulled his mother into an embrace. The palace is filled with armed men. I won't get far like this. Can you get me out of this collar? She ran her hand along the metal band inside. This needs a key. Then leave me here until you found it. Please take care though, don't give Tyr a reason to turn against you too. Frigga wrapped her arms tighter around Loki.